Welcome, fellow wanderer of the wasteland, to the darkest chambers of humanity's last desperate gamble against extinction. Tonight, we descend into the underground sanctuaries that promise salvation but delivered damnation, where white-coated scientists transform survival into suffering and hope into horror. These are the stories of Vault-Tech's most disturbing experiments. Cruel laboratories disguised as shelters, where human beings became test subjects in the name of preserving civilization. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your mind drift as we explore these sealed tombs of twisted science together. There's no need to remember every detail of the cruelty we'll witness. Just let these tales of underground horror wash over you like the gentle hum of air recyclers in endless corridors, steady and eternal in the artificial light. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let's begin our descent into the vaults where humanity's darkest impulses were given free rein beneath tons of protective steel and concrete. The story of Vault 106 begins not with the turning of locks or the sealing of blast doors, but with the careful cultivation of madness in laboratories far from the public eye. Long before the Great War painted the sky with atomic fire, military researchers had been exploring the outer boundaries of human consciousness, seeking ways to break enemy minds without breaking their bodies, to turn sanity itself into a weapon that could be deployed as easily as artillery shells or poison gas. The psychoactive compounds that would eventually fill the air systems of Vault 106 were first synthesized in sterile facilities beneath the Pentagon, where men in white coats measured doses of liquid insanity with the same precision their colleagues used to calibrate nuclear warheads. These substances represented the marriage of chemistry and psychology, designed to strip away the barriers between perception and hallucination until reality became as malleable as wet clay in the hands of those who controlled the supply. The scientists who developed these mind-altering drugs spoke in clinical terms about their research, using phrases like psychological destabilization and cognitive restructuring to describe what was, at its core, the systematic destruction of human sanity. They published papers with titles like Neurochemical Approaches to Behavioral Modification and The Military Applications of Hallucinogenic Compounds, academic language that concealed the horror of their true purpose, turning the human mind into a battlefield where reality and nightmare waged endless war. When Vault-Tech's planners began designing their network of underground shelters, they saw in these compounds an opportunity to conduct research that would have been impossible under peacetime ethical oversight. The controlled environment of a sealed vault, they reasoned, would provide perfect conditions for observing the long-term effects of psychoactive substances on a stable population. Here, beneath the earth, they could answer questions about human consciousness that had puzzled researchers for decades. Vault 106 was constructed in a natural cavern system southeast of Arefu, its entrance hidden among the rocky outcroppings that characterized the capital wasteland's treacherous terrain. The location was chosen not for its defensive advantages or its proximity to water sources, but for its isolation from other human settlements, ensuring that whatever experiments took place within its walls would remain hidden from outside interference or observation. The vault's design followed standard Vault-Tech specifications in most respects: living quarters for up to 200 residents, communal dining facilities, recreational areas, and all the infrastructure necessary to sustain a closed population for decades. But hidden within the ventilation systems were modifications that set Vault 106 apart from its more conventional counterparts: specialized dispensing equipment capable of introducing precisely measured quantities of psychoactive substances into the breathable atmosphere, The recruitment of residents for Vault 106 followed patterns established for other Vault projects, targeting families and individuals who had demonstrated loyalty to American values and possessed the skills necessary for rebuilding civilization after the nuclear war. These were teachers and engineers, doctors and mechanics, parents and children who believed they were securing their place in humanity's future rather than volunteering for roles as unwilling test subjects in experiments that would strip away their very sanity. Albert Leris, the man selected to serve as Vault 106's overseer, was among the few residents who understood the true nature of the facility he would govern. A former military psychologist with experience in experimental research, Leris had been recruited specifically for his willingness to prioritize scientific objectives over individual welfare, his ability to rationalize suffering in service of what he was told was the greater good of human knowledge and survival. The conspiracy of silence that Leris maintained was essential to the experiment's success, requiring him to observe the gradual destruction of his charges' mental health while convincing them that their experiences were normal responses to the stress of underground living. He would need to explain away hallucinations as tricks of artificial lighting, dismiss reports of strange visions as products of isolation, anxiety, and maintain the facade of protective leadership while presiding over the systematic poisoning of everyone under his care. When the Great War finally arrived on October 23, 2077, the residents of Vault 106 gathered at their designated shelter with the same mixture of fear and relief that characterized Vault populations across America. They carried with them the possessions they had been advised to bring, the photographs and mementos that connected them to the world they were leaving behind, the hopes and dreams they believed would sustain them through whatever trials awaited in their underground refuge. The first 10 days following the Vault's sealing passed in what would later be remembered as a golden period of false security and genuine community. Families settled into their assigned quarters, exploring the recreational facilities and marveling at the advanced technology that would sustain them through the years of surface contamination. Children played in corridors that echoed with their laughter. Adults organized work schedules and educational programs, and everyone participated in the routines of daily life that created the illusion of normalcy in their artificial environment. But on the 11th day, as the residents went about their morning routines with the comfortable familiarity that had already begun to develop, the first psychoactive compounds began flowing through Vault 106's air circulation systems. The initial doses were carefully calibrated to produce subtle effects. Slight alterations in color perception, minor distortions in spatial awareness, the kind of changes that might be dismissed as fatigue or adjustment difficulties by people already dealing with the stress of confinement. The blue tinge that gradually crept into the residents' visual field was the first unmistakable sign that something had changed in their underground world. At first, individuals experiencing this phenomenon assumed the alteration was personal, perhaps a side effect of the artificial lighting, or a symptom of eye strain from spending so much time in enclosed spaces. They mentioned it casually to family members and friends, expecting reassurance that their experiences were normal and temporary. But as hours passed and the blue discoloration intensified rather than fading, conversations began to take on an edge of concern that had been absent during the Vault's first peaceful days. Residents compared notes about their altered perceptions, seeking explanations for changes that seemed to affect everyone simultaneously. The communal dining areas buzzed with worried discussions as people tried to understand why their familiar world had taken on the alien appearance of an underwater landscape viewed through tinted glass. Overseer Leris's response to these concerns was carefully orchestrated to maintain calm while providing plausible explanations for experiences that were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. He convened meetings in which he discussed the psychological challenges of adjustment to underground living, explaining that temporary perceptual changes were common reactions to the stress of confinement, and would fade as residents became more accustomed to their new environment. The security personnel who supported Leris in maintaining order were among the few Vault residents who had been briefed on the true nature of the ongoing experiments, though their knowledge was limited to operational necessities rather than scientific details. They understood that their role was to prevent panic and maintain discipline while the research proceeded, but they were not told about the specific substances being introduced into the air supply or the long-term effects these compounds might produce. As the concentration of psychoactive drugs in the Vault's atmosphere gradually increased, the residents' experiences progressed far beyond simple color distortion to encompass hallucinations that challenged their ability to distinguish between reality and delusion. Familiar corridors began to shift and twist when viewed from the corner of one's eye, creating the impression that the Vault itself was alive and constantly changing its configuration to confuse and disorient its inhabitants. The social dynamics of Vault 106 underwent radical transformation, as shared hallucinations created false memories and imaginary experiences that seemed as real as any actual event. Residents began reporting encounters with people who did not exist, conversations that had never taken place, and threats that materialized only in minds altered by chemical intervention. Trust became impossible when perception itself could not be relied upon to provide accurate information about the world. Children were among the most severely affected by the ongoing chemical assault on their developing nervous systems, their young minds proving particularly vulnerable to substances designed to undermine cognitive stability. Parents watched in horror as their offspring began talking to invisible friends who seemed more real to them than their actual families, creating elaborate fantasy worlds that gradually replaced their connection to consensual reality. The first acts of violence erupted approximately 6 weeks after the psychoactive experiments began, triggered by hallucinations that convinced residents they were under attack by threats that existed only in their chemically altered perceptions. A father strangled his wife because he believed she had been replaced by an imposter sent to harm his children. A teenager stabbed his best friend because voices told him the boy was plotting to steal his food rations. Each incident was rationalized by perpetrators who could not understand that their perceptions had been deliberately distorted by invisible chemicals flowing through every breath they took. Leris's attempts to maintain order became increasingly desperate as the population of Vault 106 descended into collective madness that made rational communication nearly impossible. His explanations for the escalating violence, stress, claustrophobia, adjustment difficulties rang hollow even to security personnel, who were beginning to question whether their own perceptions could be trusted. The thin veneer of civilization that had characterized the Vault's early days cracked and shattered under the pressure of minds pushed beyond their capacity to process reality. The weapons that residents used against each other were improvised from tools and equipment that had been intended for construction and maintenance projects, transformed by desperate hands into instruments of violence against imaginary enemies. Kitchen knives became swords for fighting invisible invaders. Wrenches became clubs for crushing the skulls of hallucinated monsters. Electrical cables became garrots for strangling demons that existed only in minds poisoned by airborne chemistry. By the first anniversary of the Vault's sealing, the population of Vault 106 had been reduced by nearly half through violence, suicide, and medical complications, resulting from prolonged exposure to psychoactive substances. The survivors moved through corridors littered with bodies they could no longer identify with certainty, their altered perceptions making it impossible to distinguish between real corpses and hallucinated casualties of battles that had never actually taken place. The security systems that had been designed to protect the vault's residents from external threats proved useless against the internal chaos created by chemical warfare waged against sanity itself. Automated defenses could not distinguish between legitimate threats and hallucinated dangers, while human guards struggled to maintain order when their own perceptions had been compromised by the same substances that were driving the general population toward complete psychological collapse. The scientific data collected during these years of systematic mental destruction was transmitted regularly to Vault Tech researchers through communication systems that continued to function despite the chaos consuming the human population they monitored. Temperature readings, atmospheric composition analyses, and behavioral observation reports painted a clinical picture of psychological disintegration that would inform future experiments in facilities scattered across post-war America. Years passed in this state of chemically induced madness, with seasons marked not by weather changes but by fluctuations in the concentration of psychoactive compounds flowing through the vault's air systems. Some periods brought relative clarity, during which survivors could almost remember what it felt like to perceive reality accurately, while other times delivered waves of hallucinations so intense that conscious thought became nearly impossible. The children who had grown to adulthood within Vault 106's poisoned atmosphere developed into something that could barely be recognized as human, their minds shaped entirely by chemical distortion rather than natural interaction with a comprehensible world. These young adults possessed no baseline of normal perception against which to measure their experiences, making them perhaps the most tragic victims of experiments that had stolen their entire childhood and replaced it with chemically manufactured nightmare. As the years accumulated into decades, the distinction between guards and prisoners, between overseers and subjects, gradually dissolved under the equalizing influence of airborne psychoactive substances that made no exceptions for rank or authority. Leris himself succumbed to the madness he had helped unleash, his final reports becoming increasingly incoherent, as his own mind joined those he had sacrificed to the pursuit of scientific knowledge about the outer limits of human consciousness. The Vault 106 that was discovered by wasteland explorers in 2277 bore little resemblance to the hopeful community that had sealed itself away from nuclear devastation 2 centuries earlier. The survivors who still wandered its blue-tinted corridors had been reduced to something less than human by decades of chemical torture, their minds so thoroughly destroyed that they could no longer recognize other people as anything other than threats to be eliminated or ignored. The air itself remained poisoned after all these years, the dispensing systems continuing to function with mechanical reliability long after the scientists who had designed them were nothing but radioactive dust scattered across the wasteland. Any visitor who spent more than a few minutes breathing Vault 106's atmosphere would begin experiencing the same perceptual distortions that had driven its original population to madness and mutual destruction. The blue haze that had been the first sign of the vault's chemical contamination had become a permanent feature of its environment, creating an alien underwater atmosphere that served as a warning to anyone foolish enough to venture into corridors where sanity went to die. This discoloration was not merely psychological, but reflected actual changes in the optical properties of air, saturated with compounds designed to break down the barriers between perception and hallucination. The few survivors who still moved through Vault 106's passages were no longer recognizable as the teachers and engineers, parents and children who had sought shelter there so many years ago. They had become something else entirely, living laboratories for studying the long-term effects of psychoactive substances on human consciousness. Their continued existence, serving no purpose except to provide data about how completely the human mind could be destroyed while still maintaining basic biological functions. The ultimate irony of Vault 106 was that its experiments had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of the scientists who had conceived them, answering every question about the effects of prolonged chemical assault on human consciousness, while simultaneously demonstrating that some knowledge comes at a price too terrible to justify its acquisition. The Vault stood as a monument to the proposition that there are aspects of human experience that should never be subjected to scientific inquiry, mysteries of mind and perception that are better left unexplored. In the end, Vault 106 represented the logical conclusion of research that treated human consciousness as nothing more than a chemical process to be manipulated and studied, reducing the miracle of awareness itself to data points on graphs charting the dissolution of sanity. The blue haze that filled its corridors was not just the visible manifestation of airborne psychoactive compounds, but the color of madness itself, a permanent reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The door that condemned the residents of Vault 12 to a lifetime of radioactive horror was not broken by accident, nor damaged by the nuclear fire that rained down upon America on October 23rd, 2077. It was deliberately engineered to fail at the moment when its protection would be most desperately needed. Designed by Vault-Tec engineers who calculated the precise tolerances required to ensure that salvation would transform into damnation with mechanical reliability. The corporate boardrooms where this decision was made echoed with discussions about acceptable casualty rates and scientific value, conversations in which human lives were reduced to statistical probabilities and experimental variables. The men and women who signed off on Vault 12 specifications spoke in the sanitized language of corporate efficiency, using phrases like controlled exposure parameters and radiation tolerance studies to describe what was, in essence, a plan to slowly poison an entire community for the advancement of scientific knowledge. Vault 12 had been marketed to potential residents as the most advanced shelter in the entire Vault-Tec network, a technological marvel that would preserve not just life but comfort during the dark years that would follow nuclear war. The promotional materials distributed to families in the Bakersfield area painted pictures of underground gardens where children could play safely, advanced water purification systems that would provide clean drinking water indefinitely, and recreational facilities that would make the transition to underground living as painless as possible. The families who applied for spaces in Vault 12 were among the most optimistic and forward-thinking members of their communities, people who believed that human ingenuity and American engineering could overcome any challenge, even nuclear annihilation. They were teachers and small business owners, mechanics and nurses, parents who wanted to ensure their children would inherit a world worth living in, despite the growing tensions between America and its enemies overseas. The Vault's location in the Mojave Desert was chosen specifically for its isolation from major population centers, ensuring that when the experimental contamination began, there would be no outside observers to document the gradual transformation of healthy human beings into radiation-scarred outcasts. The desert's harsh environment would also serve as a natural barrier, making it difficult for residents to flee even if they realized what was happening to them. The construction of Vault 12 proceeded according to standard Vault-Tec protocols in all respects save one: the massive blast door that would seal the entrance when nuclear war finally arrived. While other vaults received doors engineered to withstand direct nuclear strikes and remain sealed for decades, Vault 12's entrance was fitted with mechanisms designed to malfunction at the critical moment when protection was most needed. The engineering team responsible for this sabotage worked in complete secrecy, their modifications hidden within the complex machinery that operated the vault's entrance systems. To casual inspection, everything appeared normal. The massive gears and hydraulic systems looked identical to those installed in other facilities. The control systems followed standard Vault-Tec designs, and even detailed technical inspections revealed nothing obviously wrong with the door's construction. But buried deep within the mechanical systems were components designed to fail when subjected to the electromagnetic pulse that would accompany nuclear detonations, ensuring that the door would jam in a partially open position just when its protection would mean the difference between life and death. The designers had calculated the precise degree of opening that would allow maximum radiation exposure, while maintaining the appearance of a mechanical failure rather than deliberate sabotage. The residents who moved into Vault 12 during the weeks leading up to the Great War had no reason to suspect that their shelter was anything other than what it appeared to be, a state-of-the-art facility designed to preserve human life and civilization through the coming nuclear winter. They organized themselves into committees for managing food distribution, established educational programs for the children, and created work schedules that would maintain the Vault's systems during their extended underground residence. The sense of community that developed during these early days was genuine and heartwarming, with neighbors who had barely known each other on the surface, forming bonds of friendship and mutual support that they believed would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Families shared meals in the communal dining areas, children played games in corridors that echoed with laughter, and adults planned for a future that would emerge from their underground cocoon stronger and more united than ever before. When the air raid sirens began wailing across America on that fateful October morning, the residents of Vault 12 responded with the calm efficiency that their drills had prepared them for, gathering their essential possessions and making their way to the entrance where Vault-Tec personnel would supervise the final sealing of their sanctuary. They carried with them the photographs and keepsakes that connected them to the world they were leaving behind, the treasured objects that would help them remember who they had been before the bombs fell. The massive blast door began its closing sequence as nuclear fire bloomed across the horizon, its ponderous movement creating the illusion that salvation was only moments away. The residents watched with relief and anticipation as tons of reinforced steel gradually obscured their view of the outside world, believing that they were witnessing the final step in their transition from potential victims to protected survivors of humanity's greatest catastrophe. But as the door approached the closed position that would seal them safely away from radioactive contamination, the mechanical systems that had been sabotaged months earlier began to malfunction exactly as their designers had intended. Gears stripped under loads they had been weakened to handle, hydraulic lines burst under pressures they had been designed to fail beneath, and control circuits shorted out when exposed to electromagnetic pulses that similar systems in other vaults were engineered to withstand. The grinding halt that stopped the blast door just 18 inches short of complete closure seemed like a temporary setback that Vault-Tec technicians would surely remedy within hours or days at most. The gap that remained might allow some contamination to enter the vault, but the residents reassured themselves that their advanced air filtration systems would protect them from the worst effects of radiation exposure while repair crews worked to complete the door's closing sequence. The first radioactive particles began drifting into Vault 12 within minutes of the door's failure to close completely, carried by air currents that had been contaminated by nuclear detonations across the American Southwest. The Geiger counters that monitored radiation levels throughout the facility registered the initial influx as minor increases that fell well within tolerable ranges, creating false confidence that the partial seal would prove adequate for protecting the vault's population. But as hours passed and the door remained frozen in its partially open position, the steady accumulation of radioactive contamination began to overwhelm even the vault's advanced filtration systems, designed to handle the minor amounts of radiation that might leak through imperfect seals, rather than the massive exposure created by the deliberately sabotaged entrance. The air itself became increasingly dangerous to breathe, carrying particles that would lodge in lungs and begin the slow process of cellular destruction from within. The first symptoms of radiation sickness appeared within days, rather than the weeks or months that might have been expected from lower levels of exposure, affecting the most vulnerable residents, children, elderly, and those with pre-existing health conditions, before gradually spreading to encompass the entire population. These early signs were subtle enough to be misattributed to stress or poor air quality, allowing hope to persist even as the biological damage accumulated with each breath. The nausea and fatigue that characterized the initial stages of radiation exposure were dismissed by many residents as natural responses to the stress and confinement of underground living, symptoms that would surely fade as they adapted to their new environment. The medical personnel within the vault, while concerned by the widespread nature of these complaints, had no reason to suspect that radiation was the cause, since they believed their shelter's integrity remained intact despite the jammed door. As days turned into weeks and the symptoms persisted rather than improving, a more serious assessment of the vault's condition began to reveal the true scope of the radiation exposure that was slowly killing everyone inside Vault 12. The Geiger counters that had initially registered only minor increases now showed readings that indicated lethal levels of contamination throughout the facility, concentrations that would prove fatal to anyone exposed for extended periods. The gradual realization that their supposed sanctuary had become a death trap triggered panic among some residents and desperate denial among others, with community leaders struggling to maintain order, while medical personnel attempted to treat conditions for which they had neither adequate supplies nor effective treatments. The advanced medical facilities that Vault Tech had installed were designed to handle routine injuries and illnesses, not the systematic radiation poisoning of an entire population. The physical changes that began manifesting in the Vault's residents were initially subtle enough to be attributed to poor lighting or stress-related appearance changes, but gradually became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Hair began falling out in clumps. Skin took on an unhealthy pallor that seemed to indicate internal illness, and wounds healed more slowly than normal, suggesting that cellular repair mechanisms were being compromised by ongoing radiation damage. The children were among the first to show visible signs of the mutation that would transform Vault 12's population from normal humans into the radiation-scarred beings known as ghouls, their young bodies apparently more susceptible to the cellular changes induced by prolonged exposure to radioactive particles. Parents watched in horror as their offspring began to develop the characteristic skin lesions and tissue deterioration that would mark them as fundamentally different from normal humanity. The psychological impact of witnessing these physical transformations was perhaps even more devastating than the radiation exposure itself, as residents were forced to confront the reality that they were becoming something other than human, something that the outside world would view as monstrous rather than merely unfortunate. The mirrors throughout the vault became sources of horror rather than routine grooming aids, reflecting faces that grew increasingly alien with each passing day. Medical personnel within the vault documented the progression of ghoulification with the clinical precision that their training demanded, creating detailed records of the cellular changes and physiological adaptations that were transforming their patients into something that medical textbooks had no precedent for describing. These reports would eventually prove valuable for understanding the long-term effects of radiation exposure, but provided no comfort to those experiencing the transformation firsthand. The social dynamics within Vault 12 underwent radical changes as the physical mutations progressed, with some residents forming support groups to help each other cope with their transformation, while others withdrew into isolation, unable to accept what they were becoming. Relationships that had been based on physical attraction or conventional social interactions had to be rebuilt around new realities of altered appearance and uncertain future prospects. The discovery that the ghoulification process, while horrifying in its physical effects, actually provided increased resistance to radiation exposure, came as a mixed blessing to Vault 12's residents, offering hope for survival while simultaneously confirming that they would never again be able to live as normal human beings. The cellular changes that scarred their skin and altered their appearance also enabled them to function in radioactive environments that would prove lethal to unmodified humans. The debate over whether to remain in the vault or venture onto the surface began as soon as it became clear that the ghoulification process had stabilized rather than proving immediately fatal, with some residents arguing that their transformation made them better suited for survival in the post-war world, while others insisted that the vault remained their only hope for safety and community. These discussions were complicated by the reality that their altered appearance would make acceptance by normal humans unlikely, if not impossible. The first scouting expeditions to the surface revealed a world transformed by nuclear war into a landscape that seemed almost designed for ghoul habitation, with radiation levels that would sicken or kill normal humans, but posed no additional threat to those who had already undergone the cellular adaptations induced by prolonged exposure. The wasteland that stretched beyond the vault's entrance was harsh and dangerous, but it was also free from the social constraints and prejudices that would make integration with human communities difficult or impossible. The summer of 2083 marked the beginning of the Great Exodus from Vault 12, as approximately 2/3 of the surviving population made the decision to leave their underground shelter and attempt to establish new lives on the surface, despite the challenges posed by their altered appearance and the hostile environment of the post-war world. These pioneers carried with them the technical knowledge and social organization skills they had preserved during their years underground, assets that would prove crucial for survival in the wasteland. The ghouls who remained in Vault 12 chose to stay for various reasons. Some feared the surface world's dangers. Others felt too attached to the community they had built underground to abandon it, and still others believed that their transformation made them guardians of the facility that had both cursed and saved them. These holdouts would eventually transform their former shelter into something entirely new, adapting its facilities to meet the unique needs of their altered physiology. The city of Necropolis that emerged from the abandoned ruins of a pre-war settlement became the first true ghoul community in the post-war world, established by Vault 12 survivors as a place where their kind could live without fear of persecution or rejection by normal humans. The name they chose for their new home reflected both the death they had experienced during their transformation and the new life they hoped to build despite the losses they had endured. The architecture of Necropolis was modified to accommodate the physical needs of ghouls, whose altered metabolism and sensory capabilities required different lighting, temperature, and space configurations than those optimal for normal humans. Streets were widened to accommodate residents whose mobility might be impaired by radiation damage. Buildings were reinforced to provide protection from the harsh wasteland environment, and medical facilities were established to treat conditions unique to the ghoulified population. The social structure that developed in Necropolis reflected the egalitarian principles that had sustained Vault 12's residents through their underground ordeal, with leadership positions filled through democratic processes rather than appointment by outside authorities. The community's founding documents explicitly rejected the prejudices and hierarchies that had characterized pre-war society, establishing Necropolis as a refuge where worth was measured by character and contribution rather than appearance or origin. The prejudice and fear that ghouls encountered when they attempted to establish contact with human settlements across the wasteland confirmed their worst fears about how their transformation would be received by those who retained normal appearance leading many to conclude that separation was preferable to the constant struggle for acceptance in communities that would never fully embrace them as equals. The hostility they faced ranged from verbal abuse and social ostracism to outright violence from humans who viewed them as monsters rather than fellow survivors. The tragic irony of Vault 12's story lay in the fact that its residents had survived the ultimate catastrophe only to find themselves forever excluded from the human community they had sought to preserve, their physical transformation marking them as outsiders, despite their retention of human intelligence, emotion, and moral capacity. They had gained the ability to survive in the post-war world, at the cost of belonging to the society they had hoped to help rebuild. The medical knowledge gained through studying Vault 12's transformation would eventually prove valuable for treating radiation exposure in other populations, but this scientific benefit came at the cost of condemning an entire community to lives of isolation and discrimination, raising profound questions about whether any research findings could justify the suffering required to obtain them. The Vault's residents had become unwilling martyrs to scientific progress, their sacrifice contributing to human knowledge while simultaneously excluding them from humanity itself. The descendants of Vault 12's original population continued to inhabit Necropolis and other ghoul communities throughout the wasteland, preserving the cultural memory of their ancestors' sacrifice while building new traditions adapted to their unique circumstances and needs. Their society developed art, literature, and customs that reflected both their human heritage and their transformed reality, creating a distinctive civilization that bridged the gap between the old world and the new. The door that had failed to close properly on that October day in 2077 remained a powerful symbol of broken promises and deliberate betrayal, a physical reminder that the corporations and government agencies entrusted with protecting American citizens had instead chosen to use them as test subjects in experiments that prioritized scientific knowledge over human welfare. The 18-inch gap that had seemed like a minor mechanical failure had proved to be a carefully calculated opening to hell itself. In the end, Vault 12's legacy was not the scientific data it provided about radiation exposure and ghoulification, but the community of survivors who refused to let their transformation define their worth or limit their contributions to the post-war world, proving that humanity could survive even the most deliberate attempts to destroy it through corporate callousness and scientific hubris. The mind of Dr. Stanislaus Braun was a labyrinth of brilliance and madness, where genius and cruelty had become so thoroughly intertwined that separating one from the other was like trying to extract radiation from contaminated water. Theoretically possible, but practically meaningless, when the damage had already been done, long before the Great War reduced civilization to ash and memory. Braun had established himself as one of pre-war America's most celebrated scientists, his innovations in virtual reality technology earning him accolades from academic institutions and government contracts worth millions of dollars. The laboratories where Braun conducted his early research were marvels of technological sophistication, filled with prototype computers that occupied entire rooms and virtual reality interfaces that seemed like magic to contemporary observers who had never imagined that human consciousness could be separated from physical reality and transplanted into artificial worlds, limited only by the, say, programmer's imagination and processing power. These facilities hummed with the constant activity of researchers who believed they were pioneering technologies that would revolutionize entertainment, education, and human communication in ways that would make the world a better place for everyone. Braun's colleagues in the scientific community spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and unease, recognizing his undeniable brilliance while sensing something unsettling in his complete lack of interest in the human applications of his work beyond their value. as data points in his ongoing research. He showed no excitement about the potential for his virtual reality systems to provide entertainment or education, no enthusiasm for their possible therapeutic applications, no concern for the ethical implications of technologies that could manipulate human perception and memory with unprecedented precision. The corporation that would become known as FutureTech emerged from Braun's research as a subsidiary of Vault-Tec, tasked with developing advanced technologies that would preserve human civilization through the nuclear war that military analysts increasingly viewed as inevitable rather than merely possible. Braun's role as the division's chief scientist gave him access to unlimited funding and complete freedom to pursue research directions that more conventional institutions might have questioned on ethical or practical grounds. The Garden of Eden creation kit that would eventually become one of Vault-Tec's most celebrated innovations represented the intersection of Braun's technical brilliance and his fundamental disconnection from human empathy, a terraforming device capable of transforming radioactive wasteland into fertile paradise, but designed by a man who viewed human beings as nothing more than biological machines to be manipulated for his own intellectual satisfaction. The JEC was undoubtedly a masterpiece of engineering that would save countless lives in the post-war world, but its creation process involved experiments on human subjects that would have horrified anyone capable of viewing test subjects as fellow human beings, rather than merely complex laboratory equipment. The virtual reality pods that Braun developed for Vault 112 represented the culmination of decades of research into the manipulation of human consciousness, sophisticated life support systems that could maintain biological functions indefinitely, while the subject's mind was immersed in artificial realities, indistinguishable from actual experience. These devices were technological marvels that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with pre-war science, but they were also instruments of torture, designed to trap human consciousness in digital prisons where suffering could be prolonged indefinitely without the mercy of death or the relief of unconsciousness. The selection of Smith Casey's garage as the surface entrance to Vault 112 was typical of Vault-Tec's approach to concealing their most controversial facilities, choosing locations that appeared abandoned or insignificant to casual observers, while providing secure access to underground installations where activities too sensitive for public scrutiny could be conducted without interference from government oversight or public protest. The garage itself was a perfect cover, maintaining the appearance of a small business that had simply closed down like thousands of others during the economic turbulence that preceded the Great War. The recruitment of subjects for Vault 112 followed patterns that Braun had established during his earlier research, targeting individuals whose disappearance would be unlikely to attract attention from law enforcement or family members, elderly people without close relatives, homeless individuals whose absence would go unnoticed, mentally ill patients whose claims about their experiences would be dismissed as delusions even if they managed to communicate them to outside authorities. The 85 people who eventually found themselves sealed within Vault 112 represented a cross-section of society's most vulnerable members. Individuals who had been selected not for their potential contributions to post-war civilization, but for their availability as experimental subjects whose suffering would generate no inconvenient investigations or demands for accountability. They were teachers forced into early retirement by budget cuts, veterans whose service-related disabilities had left them dependent on government assistance, elderly widows whose children lived too far away to maintain regular contact. The virtual reality systems that Braun had installed throughout Vault 112 were presented to incoming residents as recreational facilities designed to provide entertainment and mental stimulation during their extended confinement advanced technologies that would allow them to experience adventures and visit locations that would be impossible in their underground shelter. The promotional materials described virtual vacations to exotic destinations, educational programs that would allow them to learn new skills and explore new interests, and social platforms where they could interact with other Vault residents in shared virtual spaces. The initial experiences that Braun provided for his unwilling subjects were carefully designed to build trust and enthusiasm for the virtual reality systems, offering pleasant simulations of idealized suburban life, where the sun always shone, the gardens were always perfectly manicured, and the neighbors were always friendly and helpful. These early programs were indistinguishable from the utopian environments that pre-war advertising had promised virtual reality technology would eventually provide, creating the illusion that Vault-Tec had delivered on its commitment to preserving the American way of life even in the depths of underground shelters. But Braun's true interest was not in providing comfort or entertainment for his subjects, but in exploring the outer limits of human psychological endurance, testing how much suffering consciousness could absorb before breaking completely, or adapting in ways that might provide insights into the fundamental nature of awareness itself. His scientific curiosity about human pain was entirely divorced from any empathy for those who would experience it, approaching torture with the same methodical precision that other researchers might bring to studying chemical reactions or mechanical stress tolerances. The transition from pleasant virtual experiences to systematic torture was gradual enough to prevent subjects from immediately recognizing what was happening to them, with Braun introducing small elements of discomfort and uncertainty that could be rationalized as normal challenges within the simulation, rather than deliberate cruelty designed to cause psychological trauma. A beautiful virtual garden might occasionally feature insects that bit a little too hard. A perfect virtual home might develop plumbing problems that caused minor inconveniences. A friendly virtual neighbor might occasionally make comments that seemed slightly inappropriate or hostile. These incremental increases in virtual suffering served multiple purposes in Braun's experimental design, allowing him to study how human consciousness adapted to gradually worsening conditions, while also providing him with the sadistic pleasure that had become his primary motivation for continuing research that served no legitimate scientific purpose beyond satisfying his curiosity about the mechanisms of human misery. The complete control that Braun exercised over his subjects' virtual experiences was unprecedented in the history of human experimentation, surpassing even the most extreme programs conducted by totalitarian governments, because it extended beyond mere physical torture to encompass the manipulation of reality itself. His subjects could not escape through death because he controlled their virtual bodies, could not find relief through unconsciousness because he controlled their sleep cycles, could not maintain sanity through contact with others because he controlled every aspect of their social interactions. The virtual deaths that Braun inflicted on his subjects were not merciful releases from suffering, but elaborate productions designed to maximize psychological trauma before resurrection restored them to consciousness with memories intact, ensuring that each death experience accumulated rather than replacing previous trauma. He experimented with different methods of virtual execution: burning, drowning, dismemberment, disease, studying how each approach affected his subjects' subsequent behavior and psychological state. The resurrection process that followed each virtual death was carefully calibrated to maintain the subject's usefulness as experimental resources while preventing them from developing psychological adaptations that might reduce their capacity for suffering. Braun discovered that complete memory erasure between deaths reduced the cumulative trauma that was central to his research objectives, while partial memory retention created confusion and anxiety that enhanced the psychological impact of subsequent torture sessions. The virtual environments that Braun created for his experiments were not random selections but carefully designed scenarios intended to exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities that he had identified in each subject through preliminary observation and testing. A subject with claustrophobia might find themselves repeatedly trapped in increasingly confined spaces, while someone with social anxiety might be forced to endure virtual social situations that became progressively more humiliating and hostile. The artificial intelligence systems that Braun used to populate his virtual worlds were programmed with personality matrices derived from his subjects' own psychological profiles, creating virtual characters who knew exactly which buttons to push to cause maximum emotional distress, while maintaining plausible relationships that prevented subjects from completely withdrawing from social interaction. These AI constructs were perhaps Braun's most diabolical innovation, turning his subjects' own vulnerabilities into weapons that could be wielded against them with perfect knowledge of their weaknesses and fears. The cycles of torture and resurrection that defined existence within Vault 112's virtual reality systems continued for over 2 centuries, with Braun's subjects experiencing thousands of deaths and rebirths, while their creator refined his techniques and explored new methods of inflicting psychological suffering. The sheer duration of this experimentation was possible only because the virtual environment freed Braun from the limitations that constrained physical torture. His subjects' virtual bodies could not develop tolerance to pain, could not die from shock or trauma, could not escape through madness, because their mental state was as much under his control as their physical experiences. The isolation that Braun experienced during his centuries of virtual torture was perhaps the only factor that prevented his experiments from becoming even more elaborate and extensive, as his own psychological deterioration gradually reduced his creativity and motivation for developing new tortures. But even as his mind decayed from prolonged isolation, his sadistic impulses remained intact, driving him to continue his experiments long after they had ceased to provide any scientific insights and served only to satisfy his compulsive need to inflict suffering on helpless victims. The discovery of Vault 112 by the Lone Wanderer in 2277 represented the first outside contact that Braun had experienced since sealing himself into his underground laboratory 2 centuries earlier, an encounter that provided him with the stimulation of a new test subject while also creating the possibility that his long isolation might finally end. The Wanderer's arrival offered Braun the choice between continuing his solitary experiments and potentially returning to a world that had moved far beyond the civilization he had known before the war. The virtual world of Tranquility Lane that Braun constructed for the Lone Wanderer's experience was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that compressed centuries of experimental knowledge into a single environment designed to test his new subject's moral flexibility and capacity for violence. The seemingly innocent suburban setting concealed layers of horror that would gradually reveal themselves as the Wanderer was forced to participate in activities that challenged their ethical boundaries and tested their willingness to harm others for personal benefit. The other residents of Tranquility Lane were Braun's original subjects, their personalities modified and memories adjusted to fit the roles he had assigned them in his latest experimental scenario. These people had been tortured for so long that their original identities had been almost completely destroyed, leaving behind fragments of consciousness that existed only to serve Braun's continuing need for victims who could experience pain and fear without developing the psychological defenses that might reduce their utility as experimental subjects. The moral choice that Braun ultimately presented to the Lone Wanderer between participating in his tortures or finding a way to end them permanently represented the culmination of his research into human ethical decision-making under extreme pressure, an experiment that would determine whether his new subject possessed the strength to resist his manipulation or would succumb to the same psychological control that had enabled him to torture his other victims for centuries without significant resistance. The fail-safe system that had been installed in Vault 112's computer network provided the only means of ending Braun's experiments permanently, requiring the Wanderer to locate and activate hidden protocols that would shut down the virtual reality systems and finally grant death to subjects who had been denied that mercy for over 200 years. The existence of this failsafe suggested that even Vault Tech's engineers had recognized the potential for Braun's research to continue beyond any reasonable scientific purpose, though they had apparently been unwilling to prevent it directly. The liberation of Vault 112 subjects, when it finally came, was not the joyous reunion with reality that might have been expected, but a release into death for consciousness that had been so thoroughly traumatized and distorted by centuries of virtual torture that they could no longer function in any recognizable form. Braun's experiments had succeeded in their apparent objective of exploring the limits of human psychological endurance, but the answer they provided was that those limits, once exceeded, transformed consciousness into something that could no longer be meaningfully described as human. The legacy of Vault 112 extended far beyond the immediate suffering of its subjects to encompass broader questions about the nature of consciousness, the ethics of virtual reality technology, and the dangers of granting unlimited power over human experience to individuals whose empathy had been compromised by isolation and unchecked authority. Braun's research represented the dark side of technological progress, demonstrating that advanced capabilities could become instruments of unprecedented cruelty when wielded by those who viewed human suffering as merely another form of data to be collected and analyzed. The virtual worlds that Braun had created as instruments of torture possessed a beauty and sophistication that made them almost indistinguishable from reality, raising disturbing questions about the nature of authentic experience and the possibility that consciousness itself might be nothing more than a sophisticated simulation running on biological hardware. His work had pushed the boundaries of what was possible with artificial reality, while simultaneously demonstrating that the power to manipulate perception carried with it the responsibility to use that power ethically. In the end, Vault 112 stood as a monument to the proposition that brilliance without compassion could become the most dangerous force in any world, virtual or real, and that the technologies designed to preserve human civilization could just as easily be perverted into instruments for destroying everything that made civilization worth preserving. The doctor who had sought to unlock the secrets of consciousness had instead created a hell more terrible than any described in religious texts, a prison of the mind where suffering could continue forever without the mercy of death or the possibility of redemption. The architects who designed Vault 81 possessed a peculiar understanding of human psychology, recognizing that the most effective deceptions were those that contained enough truth to make doubt seem unreasonable, enough genuine comfort to make suspicion feel like ingratitude. The vault that emerged from their blueprints was a masterpiece of duplicity, a facility where 96 residents could live in apparent safety while remaining completely unaware that their home had been constructed as an elaborate laboratory where they served simultaneously as test subjects and potential victims in medical experiments that violated every principle of informed consent and ethical research. The public face of Vault 81 was everything that Vault Tech's marketing department had promised in their glossy brochures and reassuring television advertisements: spacious living quarters with genuine privacy for families, recreational facilities that would maintain physical and mental health during extended confinement, educational resources that would preserve human knowledge and culture through the dark years following nuclear war. The Vault's promotional materials emphasized its advanced medical facilities and research capabilities, presenting these features as additional safety measures rather than hints about the true purpose behind its construction. The families who applied for residency in Vault 81 were among the most health-conscious and medically sophisticated members of their communities, individuals who understood the importance of preventive care and cutting-edge medical research for maintaining human welfare during the challenging years that would follow global nuclear conflict. They were doctors and nurses, medical researchers and public health officials, parents who wanted to ensure their children would receive the best possible healthcare, even in the depths of an underground shelter designed to outlast civilization itself. The selection process for Vault 81's residents was more rigorous than most Vault-Tec facilities required, involving comprehensive medical examinations and psychological evaluations that were ostensibly designed to ensure the health and stability of the Vault's population during their extended confinement. But these assessments served a darker purpose, creating detailed baseline health profiles that would enable researchers to monitor the effects of experimental treatments on subjects whose pre-exposure medical status had been documented with clinical precision. The Vault's location in the Commonwealth was chosen specifically for its proximity to several major medical research institutions, ensuring that the facility would be staffed with legitimate scientists whose credentials and expertise would lend credibility to the experimental programs, while their institutional affiliations would discourage questions about research, methodologies that might not meet peacetime ethical standards. The underground facility was marketed as a continuation of important medical research that would benefit all of humanity, making participation seem like a patriotic duty rather than enrollment in unauthorized human experimentation. The construction of Vault 81 proceeded according to a dual blueprint that concealed the facility's true purpose behind layers of legitimate infrastructure and genuine amenities that would support a thriving underground community for decades if necessary. The residential areas, recreational facilities, and life support systems were built to the highest standards, providing everything necessary for comfortable long-term habitation, while diverting attention from the hidden sections where the real work of the vault would be conducted. The secret areas of Vault 81 were accessible only through concealed passages and secured doors that appeared to be maintenance access points or emergency systems to casual observation, their true purpose hidden behind mundane labels and unremarkable architecture that discouraged curiosity from residents who might otherwise wonder what lay beyond the areas designated for their daily activities. These hidden laboratories contained some of the most advanced medical equipment available in the pre-war world, research facilities that would enable experiments impossible in conventional hospital or university settings. The scientific staff assigned to Vault 81's secret research program were recruited from among the most ambitious and morally flexible members of the medical research community, individuals whose career advancement had been blocked by ethical constraints that they viewed as obstacles to scientific progress rather than necessary protections for human welfare. These researchers were promised unlimited access to test subjects, unrestricted research budgets, and complete freedom from the oversight and ethical review processes that had limited their previous work. Dr. Olivet, the physician selected to serve as overseer for Vault 81's residential population, represented a fascinating study in moral complexity, a medical professional whose genuine commitment to patient welfare existed alongside his willingness to facilitate research programs that treated human beings as laboratory animals. His participation in the Vault's secret experiments was motivated not by sadistic pleasure, but by intellectual conviction that the knowledge gained through unauthorized human testing would ultimately benefit humanity more than the suffering of individual test subjects would harm it. The medical research that Vault-Tec intended to conduct within Vault 81's hidden laboratories focused on developing universal cures for every major disease and medical condition that affected human populations, an ambitious program that required testing experimental treatments on live subjects under carefully controlled conditions that would be impossible to replicate in conventional medical facilities. The scope of this research encompassed everything from cancer and heart disease to mental illness and genetic disorders, representing humanity's most comprehensive attempt to solve medical problems that had plagued civilization since the dawn of recorded history. The experimental methodology designed for Vault 81 involved deliberately exposing residents to pathogenic organisms and disease-causing agents through the Vault's air circulation system, then monitoring their responses to experimental treatments that might cure these conditions or might cause additional health problems that would provide data about the limits of human physiological adaptation. This approach promised to generate vast amounts of medical data in a relatively short time, but it also guaranteed that many test subjects would suffer and die during the research process. The air filtration and circulation systems that would normally protect Vault residents from external contamination were modified to serve as delivery mechanisms for experimental pathogens and treatments, allowing researchers to expose the entire population to specific diseases while controlling variables like dosage, exposure duration, and treatment timing with precision impossible in natural disease outbreaks. These modifications were disguised as routine maintenance upgrades and safety improvements, ensuring that residents would not suspect their life support systems had been weaponized against them. The propellant nozzles that had been installed throughout Vault 81's residential areas served multiple functions in the facility's experimental design, capable of delivering both disease-causing agents and experimental cures through the same distribution network, while also providing a means of eliminating subjects who discovered the true nature of their situation and threatened to expose the research program to outside scrutiny. These devices were presented to residents as emergency systems designed to disperse fire suppressant or other safety chemicals in case of catastrophic system failures. The selection of diseases for testing within Vault 81 reflected both scientific priorities and practical considerations about which conditions would provide the most valuable research data, while maintaining plausible deniability about their artificial introduction into the Vault's population. Respiratory infections could be attributed to poor air circulation. Gastrointestinal illnesses could be blamed on food contamination, and neurological symptoms could be dismissed as psychological responses to the stress of confinement, allowing researchers to study disease progression and treatment effectiveness while maintaining the fiction that health problems were naturally occurring rather than deliberately induced. The medical monitoring systems that tracked every aspect of residents' health were far more comprehensive than necessary for routine healthcare, continuously collecting data about physiological responses, medication effectiveness, and disease progression that would inform ongoing research while providing early warning about subjects who might be developing immunity or resistance to experimental treatments. This surveillance was conducted through seemingly routine medical checkups and health screenings that residents welcomed as evidence of the Vault's commitment to their welfare. The experimental treatments tested within Vault 81 ranged from promising therapies that might genuinely cure major diseases to dangerous compounds that were known to cause severe side effects but offered insights into biological processes that could inform future research. Many subjects received multiple experimental drugs simultaneously, creating complex interactions that provided data about combination therapies, while also increasing the risk of adverse reactions that could prove fatal without immediate medical intervention. Dr. Olivet's growing awareness of the true scope of the experimental program created profound moral conflict between his genuine desire to protect his patients' welfare and his intellectual fascination with research that promised to revolutionize medical treatment for all of humanity. His decision to sabotage the experimental program by preventing the deliberate introduction of pathogens into the vault's air supply represented a triumph of medical ethics over scientific ambition, but it also doomed years of potentially valuable research and condemned other populations to continue suffering from diseases that might have been cured through Vault 81's experiments. The sabotage that Olivet conducted was subtle enough to avoid detection by the research staff, while effective enough to prevent the systematic exposure of residents to experimental pathogens, ensuring that the Vault's population would remain healthy, while the hidden laboratories continued operating with laboratory animals as test subjects instead of unwilling human volunteers. This compromise allowed legitimate medical research to continue while protecting innocent people from becoming unwitting participants in experiments that violated fundamental principles of medical ethics and human dignity. The laboratory animals that replaced human subjects in Vault 81's experimental program were primarily mole rats, creatures whose physiology was sufficiently similar to human biology to provide useful data about disease processes and treatment effectiveness, while avoiding the ethical complications of human experimentation. These animals were deliberately exposed to the same pathogens and experimental treatments that had originally been intended for human subjects, creating a research program that was scientifically valid but morally acceptable according to conventional standards for animal testing. The containment systems designed to prevent experimental animals from escaping their laboratory environments were sophisticated but not perfect, relying on multiple layers of security that could potentially be breached by particularly intelligent or persistent subjects who found weaknesses in the barriers designed to confine them. The researchers who worked with these animals understood the risks of escape, but considered them acceptable given the importance of their work and the precautions they had taken to minimize potential exposure to Vault residents. The research that continued within Vault 81's hidden laboratories produced valuable insights into disease treatment and prevention that would eventually benefit medical practice throughout the post-war world, demonstrating that ethical research methodologies could generate important scientific knowledge without requiring the sacrifice of unwilling human subjects. The success of this animal-based research program validated Olivet's decision to protect his patients while maintaining the facility's contribution to medical science and human welfare. The decades that followed Olivet's sabotage were characterized by the gradual development of Vault 81 into a genuine community where residents could live normal lives while contributing to legitimate medical research that advanced human knowledge without exploiting vulnerable populations. The Vault's medical facilities were used to provide healthcare services that were unavailable elsewhere in the post-war world, making it a beacon of hope for survivors who required treatment for injuries and illnesses that would have been fatal without access to advanced medical technology. The communication systems that connected Vault 81 to the outside world beginning in 2287 enabled residents to establish contact with other survivor communities while maintaining the security and stability that had characterized their underground existence for over 2 centuries. This gradual reintegration with surface civilization allowed the Vault's medical expertise to benefit a much larger population while preserving the research capabilities that had been developed during their isolation. Bobby DeLuca's discovery of the secret laboratory entrance in 2287 represented the first breach of the security systems that had protected both residents and experimental subjects from unauthorized contact for over 200 years, creating a situation that would test the containment protocols designed to prevent the spread of experimental pathogens beyond the controlled environment of the research laboratories. His curiosity about the hidden areas of his home was natural and understandable, but it also placed him at risk of exposure to dangers that had been carefully contained for centuries. Austin Engel's decision to follow DeLuca into the secret areas demonstrated the kind of loyalty and concern for others that had characterized Vault 81's community throughout its existence. But it also placed him in direct contact with experimental subjects whose infection with unknown pathogens posed immediate threats to anyone without proper protective equipment or medical countermeasures. The mole rat that bit him had been deliberately infected with diseases that were potentially fatal to humans, making his exposure a medical emergency that would test the Vault's ability to treat conditions that existed nowhere else in the post-war world. The disease that Engel contracted from his exposure to infected laboratory animals was unlike anything that conventional medical practice was equipped to treat, representing a combination of pathogenic organisms and experimental modifications that had been designed specifically for research purposes rather than natural infection patterns. His condition required immediate access to experimental treatments that had been developed during the Vault's research program, medications that were available only because of the controversial experiments that Olivet had worked so hard to prevent from affecting human subjects. The irony of Engel's situation was that his life could only be saved by treatments developed through the same research program that had endangered it, demonstrating the complex ethical considerations that surrounded medical research even when conducted with the best intentions and most stringent safety precautions. His recovery would depend on experimental drugs that had been tested on laboratory animals but never on human subjects, making him both victim and beneficiary of scientific research that had operated in the moral grey area between beneficial knowledge and potentially harmful experimentation. The continuing presence of infected laboratory animals within Vault 81's secret research facilities represented an ongoing threat to the Vault's population and potentially to the broader wasteland community, as escape or deliberate release of these experimental subjects could spread diseases that had been engineered specifically for their lethality and resistance to conventional treatments. The containment systems that had protected residents for over 2 centuries remained in place, but they required constant maintenance and monitoring to prevent catastrophic failures that could transform medical research tools into biological weapons. The medical expertise that had been preserved within Vault 81 throughout the post-war period represented one of humanity's most valuable resources for rebuilding civilization and treating the health problems that had emerged in the radioactive wasteland, but it also carried with it the responsibility to ensure that knowledge gained through controversial research would be used only for beneficial purposes, rather than causing additional harm to populations that had already suffered through nuclear war and its aftermath. In the end, Vault 81's story demonstrated that even the most well-intentioned medical research could become a source of danger when ethical constraints were removed and human subjects were treated as expendable resources rather than fellow human beings deserving of dignity and protection. But it also showed that individual moral courage could prevent terrible abuses while preserving the potential benefits that scientific knowledge could provide to all of humanity. The laboratories where the forced evolutionary virus first took shape existed in the twilight zone between legitimate scientific research and weaponized madness, Sterile facilities where brilliant minds pursued knowledge that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human evolution, while remaining willfully blind to the moral implications of their work. These underground research centers, scattered across military installations throughout the American Southwest, hummed with the constant activity of scientists who believed they were solving humanity's greatest biological challenges through the application of advanced genetic engineering and viral modification techniques. The origins of the FEV program could be traced back to the early days of the resource wars, when American military strategists began to recognize that conventional weapons would prove inadequate for the global conflicts that were rapidly approaching, conflicts that would require new forms of warfare capable of neutralizing enemy populations while leaving infrastructure and resources intact for subsequent occupation and exploitation. Biological weapons offered the tantalizing possibility of achieving military objectives through the manipulation of life itself rather than its simple destruction. The scientists recruited for the FEV program were drawn from the most prestigious universities and research institutions in America, individuals whose expertise in virology, genetics, and evolutionary biology made them uniquely qualified to pursue research that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with biological manipulation. These researchers were motivated not by malice but by intellectual curiosity and patriotic duty, convinced that their work would protect American lives by developing countermeasures to biological weapons that enemy nations were presumably developing in their own secret laboratories. The ethical framework that governed early FEV research was built on utilitarian calculations that weighed potential benefits against immediate costs, accepting that some degree of suffering would be necessary to develop treatments and countermeasures that would ultimately save far more lives than they claimed. This reasoning allowed researchers to justify experiments that violated peacetime medical ethics while maintaining their self-image as healers and protectors, rather than instruments of institutional cruelty. The viral components that formed the foundation of the forced evolutionary virus were harvested from naturally occurring pathogens that had been modified through genetic engineering to enhance their ability to rewrite human DNA while maintaining their capacity for rapid replication and environmental persistence. These modifications required sophisticated understanding of viral biology and genetic expression, knowledge that was available only to the most advanced research teams working with unlimited government funding and access to experimental subjects. The evolutionary pressure that the FEV was designed to create operated through mechanisms that accelerated natural selection processes that normally required thousands of years to produce significant changes in human physiology, compressing evolutionary adaptation into time frames that could be observed and measured within the lifespan of individual test subjects. This acceleration was achieved through viral mechanisms that directly modified genetic expression rather than waiting for random mutations to create advantageous traits through conventional evolutionary processes. The military applications that drove FEV research were focused primarily on creating soldiers who could survive in hostile environments that would prove lethal to unmodified humans, enabling American forces to operate effectively in areas contaminated with radiation, chemical weapons, or biological agents, while enemy troops would be incapacitated or killed by exposure to the same hazards. The virus was intended to transform human biology itself into a form of protective equipment that could not be removed, captured, or duplicated by opposing forces. The research facilities where FEV experiments were conducted were designed with security measures that exceeded those used for nuclear weapons development. Recognizing that biological agents capable of modifying human evolution represented threats that could potentially affect the entire species if they were released accidentally or stolen by hostile intelligence services. These laboratories operated under protocols that assumed every sample, Every test subject and every piece of research data represented an existential threat to human civilization if mishandled or misused. The initial test subjects for FEV experiments were volunteers recruited from military personnel who had been informed about the general nature of the research but not about the specific risks they would face or the irreversible nature of the changes that would be inflicted upon their bodies and minds. These soldiers believed they were participating in medical research that would improve their effectiveness in combat, while providing benefits that could eventually be extended to civilian populations facing similar environmental challenges. The consent process for FEV experimentation was deliberately structured to minimize subjects' understanding of the true scope and risks of their participation, using technical language and bureaucratic procedures that obscured the experimental nature of treatments that had never been tested on human subjects and whose long-term effects were completely unknown. Subjects were told they were receiving preventive treatments that would protect them from biological weapons, not that they were being infected with experimental viruses designed to permanently alter their genetic structure. The transformation process that FEV produced in human subjects was far more dramatic and unpredictable than researchers had anticipated based on their computer models and animal testing, creating changes that went far beyond the enhanced radiation resistance and environmental adaptation that had been the program's primary objectives. The virus proved capable of rewriting fundamental aspects of human biology, producing alterations in size, strength, metabolism, and cognitive function that created beings who could barely be recognized as human despite their obvious evolutionary origins. The physical changes induced by FEV exposure were immediately apparent and universally dramatic, with subjects experiencing rapid increases in height and muscle mass that transformed them from normal-sized humans into towering giants whose strength exceeded normal human capabilities by factors that made precise measurement difficult. These physical alterations were accompanied by changes in skin texture and coloration that gave FEV subjects a distinctive appearance that would make them immediately recognizable as products of artificial evolutionary manipulation. The cognitive effects of FEV infection proved more variable and generally more problematic than the physical changes, with most subjects experiencing significant reductions in intellectual capacity that left them capable of basic reasoning and communication, but unable to engage in the complex thinking that characterized normal human consciousness. This mental deterioration was attributed to the massive physiological changes required for physical transformation, but it also served military objectives by creating soldiers who would follow orders without questioning their moral implications. The immunity to radiation and environmental toxins that FEV subjects developed was perhaps the most successful aspect of the experimental program, creating beings who could function normally in environments that would prove lethal to unmodified humans within minutes or hours of exposure. This adaptation was achieved through modifications to cellular repair mechanisms and metabolic processes that allowed FEV subjects to process and eliminate radioactive particles and chemical toxins that would accumulate to fatal levels in normal human biology. The psychological profile of FEV subjects revealed increases in aggressive behavior and reductions in empathy that made them more effective as soldiers, while simultaneously making them dangerous to civilian populations who might encounter them during or after military operations. These behavioral changes were initially viewed as acceptable side effects that could be managed through military discipline and command structures, but they would eventually prove to be fundamental alterations in human nature that could not be controlled through conventional methods. The research teams studying FEV subjects documented their findings with scientific precision that treated the human suffering involved as necessary data collection rather than moral catastrophe, producing reports that discussed the destruction of human consciousness in the same clinical terms that might be used to describe chemical reactions or mechanical stress testing. This emotional detachment was essential for researchers who needed to continue their work despite daily exposure to evidence of the human cost of their experiments. The security protocols surrounding FEV research were designed to prevent the escape of experimental subjects who had been transformed into beings whose strength and environmental resistance made them potentially capable of surviving indefinitely in the outside world while posing threats to civilian populations who would be helpless against their enhanced physical capabilities. These containment measures included both physical barriers and psychological conditioning intended to ensure that subjects would remain under military control, regardless of their enhanced abilities. The Great War's impact on FEV research was immediate and devastating, disrupting supply lines and communication networks that connected research facilities while eliminating the command structures that provided oversight and strategic direction for experimental programs. The nuclear attacks that destroyed major population centers also eliminated many of the government officials and military leaders who understood the scope and implications of FEV research, leaving individual facilities to continue their work without external guidance or coordination. Vault 87's selection as a primary site for continued FEV research was based on its strategic location near Washington, D.C., and its proximity to the underground settlement of Little Lamplight, which would provide a steady supply of test subjects for experiments that could no longer rely on voluntary military participation. The Vault's advanced facilities and secure environment made it ideal for conducting research that required long-term isolation from outside interference while maintaining access to human subjects who could be acquired without arousing suspicion from other survivor communities. The transformation of Vault 87 from a conventional shelter into a dedicated FEV research facility required extensive modifications to accommodate the special needs of subjects who had been physically transformed through viral infection, including reinforced containment areas capable of holding beings whose strength exceeded normal human capabilities by enormous margins. These modifications were presented to incoming residents as safety improvements designed to protect them from external threats, rather than preparations for containing the monsters they would become. The overseer selected to manage Vault 87's FEV program was a military officer whose background in biological warfare research made him uniquely qualified to oversee experiments that required both scientific expertise and military discipline to maintain security, while pursuing research objectives that civilian administrators might have found ethically problematic. His authority extended to all aspects of Vault operations, including the selection of subjects for experimental treatment and the disposal of subjects whose transformation had proved unsuccessful or problematic. The resident population of Vault 87 included families with children who had been specifically recruited because their presence would provide researchers with opportunities to study the effects of FEV infection on developing nervous systems and growing bodies, research that was impossible to conduct with adult subjects whose physiological development had already been completed. These children and their parents were told they were participating in medical research designed to protect them from radiation exposure, not that they were being infected with experimental viruses that would fundamentally alter their humanity. The infection process used in Vault 87 involved direct injection of concentrated FEV into subjects who had been sedated for what they believed were routine medical procedures, eliminating the unpredictability and time delays associated with airborne transmission, while ensuring that precise doses could be administered according to research protocols. This approach maximized the scientific value of each subject while minimizing the risk that infections would spread beyond the intended experimental population. The transformation chambers where FEV subjects were monitored during their physical and mental changes were designed to accommodate the dramatic increases in size and strength that characterized successful infections, while also providing complete observation capabilities that allowed researchers to document every aspect of the transformation process for analysis and comparison with other experimental subjects. These facilities were presented to subjects as medical treatment areas, where they would recover from preventive treatments, concealing their true purpose as observation laboratories for studying the destruction of human consciousness. The classification system that researchers developed for categorizing FEV subjects reflected both scientific interest in the variety of transformations that the virus could produce and practical concerns about which subjects would be most useful for ongoing research or military applications. Subjects who retained significant cognitive function were designated as successful transformations, while those who experienced severe mental deterioration were classified as failures and used for studies of biological processes that did not require intelligent cooperation. The food and resource requirements of FEV subjects far exceeded those of normal humans, reflecting the massive metabolic changes required to maintain their enlarged bodies and enhanced immune systems, while providing the energy necessary for accelerated healing and environmental adaptation. These increased nutritional needs created logistical challenges that had not been anticipated during the initial design of FEV research protocols, requiring modifications to supply systems and rationing procedures that affected all Vault residents. The social dynamics within Vault 87's research population were complicated by the gradual transformation of some residents into beings whose physical appearance and mental capacity made normal social interaction increasingly difficult, creating tensions between subjects who had been infected with FEV and those who remained unmodified while waiting their turn for experimental treatment. These divisions were managed through segregation policies that separated transformed subjects from the general population, while maintaining the fiction that everyone was receiving similar medical care. The escape that eventually occurred in Vault 87 was not a planned rebellion, but a spontaneous outbreak of violence triggered by the combination of enhanced physical capabilities, reduced cognitive control, and accumulated psychological trauma that characterized advanced FEV infection. The subjects who broke free from containment were not acting according to rational plans, but responding to instinctive drives that had been altered by their viral transformation, making their actions unpredictable and extremely dangerous to anyone who encountered them. The massacre of research, staff, and security personnel that followed the containment breach demonstrated the futility of attempting to control beings whose physical capabilities had been enhanced far beyond normal human limits, while their psychological restraints had been removed through brain damage caused by viral infection. The weapons and security measures that had been adequate for controlling normal human subjects proved useless against creatures who could tear through reinforced barriers with their bare hands, while shrugging off injuries that would incapacitate or kill unmodified humans. The spread of escaped FEV subjects throughout the capital wasteland created the first super mutant population in the post-war world, establishing communities of transformed beings who would become permanent fixtures of the wasteland ecology, while posing ongoing threats to human settlements that lacked the weapons or knowledge necessary to defend themselves against creatures who combined enhanced physical capabilities with unpredictable, aggressive behavior and limited reasoning ability. The super mutant society that developed from Vault 87's escaped subjects was organized around simple hierarchical structures based on physical strength and aggressive dominance, rather than the complex social relationships that characterized human communities, reflecting the cognitive limitations that FEV infection had imposed on beings who retained some memories of their human origins, but lacked the intellectual capacity to maintain human civilization. The reproductive biology of super mutants remained poorly understood even by the subjects themselves, with most apparently lacking the capacity for natural reproduction, while possessing instinctive drives to increase their population through the capture and infection of human subjects who could be transformed through exposure to FEV-related biological agents. This expansion mechanism ensured that super mutant populations would continue growing despite their inability to reproduce naturally, while also creating ongoing conflicts with human communities who represented both threats to super mutant security and sources of new recruits for their ranks. The military equipment and weapons that super mutants acquired through raids on human settlements or recovery from pre-war facilities were often modified or improvised to accommodate their enhanced size and strength, creating crude but effective armaments that reflected their practical intelligence while demonstrating the limitations imposed by their reduced cognitive capabilities. These weapons were typically oversized versions of conventional firearms or melee weapons, built for durability and stopping power rather than precision or technological sophistication. The territorial behavior exhibited by super mutant communities reflected both their enhanced physical capabilities and their simplified social structures, with groups claiming and defending areas that provided access to resources necessary for their survival, while eliminating potential threats from human settlements or rival super mutant factions. These territories were typically centered on defensible locations like buildings, caves, or other structures that could accommodate their enlarged bodies, while providing protection from environmental hazards and enemy attacks. The relationship between super mutants and other wasteland creatures was characterized by mutual avoidance or open conflict, with most animals lacking the size and strength necessary to pose threats to beings whose viral transformation had made them apex predators in most ecological contexts. The few creatures that could challenge super mutants were typically other products of post-war mutation or artificial enhancement, creating complex predator-prey relationships that shaped the evolution of wasteland ecosystems. The memory fragments that some super mutants retained from their human existence created psychological conflicts between their current nature and their recollections of human social relationships, family bonds, and moral concepts that no longer corresponded to their simplified cognitive and emotional capabilities. These internal contradictions sometimes manifested as unpredictable behavior patterns that made super mutant actions difficult for human observers to predict or understand. In the end, Vault 87's FEV experiments succeeded in creating enhanced beings capable of surviving in the harsh post-war environment. But they achieved this success by destroying everything that made their subjects recognizably human, demonstrating that evolution forced through artificial means might preserve biological function while eliminating the consciousness, culture, and moral capacity that defined human civilization itself. The science of human cloning in the years before the Great War had progressed far beyond the tentative first steps that characterized early genetic research, evolving into sophisticated technologies that could replicate not merely physical characteristics, but entire human beings, with unprecedented precision and reliability. The laboratories where these techniques were perfected operated in the shadows of legitimate medical research, funded by government contracts that spoke vaguely of genetic therapy and population studies, while pursuing objectives that would have horrified the public if their true scope had been revealed through congressional oversight or investigative journalism. The researchers who pioneered human cloning technology were motivated by a mixture of scientific curiosity and utilitarian philosophy that viewed individual human beings as biological machines whose components could be duplicated, modified, and improved through the application of advanced genetic engineering techniques. These scientists spoke in clinical terms about their work, using phrases like genetic optimization and biological manufacturing to describe processes that reduced human reproduction to industrial procedures conducted in sterile laboratories rather than natural relationships between loving partners. The ethical frameworks that governed cloning research were constructed around arguments that emphasized potential benefits for treating genetic diseases and addressing population declines that might follow nuclear war, presenting human duplication as a form of medical therapy rather than the fundamental violation of human dignity that critics claimed it represented. These justifications allowed researchers to pursue experiments that treated human consciousness as a reproducible commodity while maintaining their professional reputations within the broader scientific community. Vault 108 was conceived as the ultimate testing ground for cloning technology, a facility where researchers could study the long-term effects of human duplication on individual psychology and social dynamics while maintaining complete control over experimental variables that would be impossible to manage in conventional research settings. The Vault's design incorporated specialized laboratories equipped with cloning facilities that could produce multiple copies of selected subjects, while providing observation capabilities that would document every aspect of their prod, development, and interaction. The location selected for Vault 108 between Canterbury Commons and the Corvega factory reflected strategic considerations about maintaining secrecy while ensuring access to the resources and personnel necessary for conducting complex genetic research over extended periods. The facility's isolation would prevent outside interference with experimental programs, while its proximity to transportation networks would facilitate the delivery of equipment and supplies necessary for maintaining sophisticated cloning operations indefinitely. The resident population recruited for Vault 108 was deliberately diverse, encompassing 475 individuals from different racial, ethnic, and social backgrounds, who had been selected not for their potential contributions to post-war civilization, but for their value as genetic templates that could be used to create clones, representing the full spectrum of human genetic variation. These residents were told they were participating in population diversity studies designed to ensure genetic stability during their extended underground isolation. The family structures that developed within Vault 108 during its early months reflected the natural human tendency to form social bonds and mutual support networks, even under artificial conditions, with residents creating relationships based on shared interests, compatible personalities, and romantic attraction rather than the genetic compatibility that would become central to the facility's experimental program. These organic social developments provided researchers with baseline data about normal human behavior that would serve as control groups for studying the effects of introducing clones into established communities. The cloning subject selected for Vault 108's primary research program was a middle-aged maintenance worker named Gary, whose genetic profile and psychological characteristics made him an ideal template for studying the effects of human duplication on individual identity and social integration. Gary was chosen not because of any exceptional qualities, but precisely because of his ordinariness. His average intelligence, unremarkable appearance, and conventional personality traits would make him a representative sample of normal humanity whose duplication could provide insights applicable to the broader population. The informed consent process that preceded Gary's selection as a cloning subject was deliberately structured to minimize his understanding of the true scope and implications of his participation, presenting the procedure as routine genetic testing that would help researchers understand hereditary factors that might affect Vault residents during their extended confinement. Gary was told that tissue samples would be used for medical research that could benefit everyone in the Vault, not that his genetic material would be used to create multiple copies of himself who would live alongside him in the same facility. The cloning laboratory within Vault 108 represented the pinnacle of pre-war genetic engineering technology, containing equipment capable of producing genetically identical humans from cellular samples, while accelerating their physical development to maturity within timeframes that would allow researchers to study multiple generations of clones. During the Vault's operational period, these facilities operated according to protocols that treated human reproduction as a manufacturing process, subject to quality control measures and efficiency optimization, rather than the natural biological process that had characterized human procreation throughout history. The first Gary clone emerged from the laboratory's artificial gestation systems as a physically perfect duplicate of the original subject, possessing identical genetic markers, facial features, and body structure, while lacking the accumulated memories and life experiences that had shaped the original Gary's personality and behavioral patterns. This initial clone was designated Gary 2 and was introduced into the Vault's general population as a new resident, whose resemblance to the original Gary was explained as coincidental similarity rather than artificial duplication. The psychological development of Gary 2 proceeded according to patterns that researchers had predicted based on their understanding of how genetic factors influenced personality development, with the clone displaying behavioral tendencies and cognitive capabilities that closely matched those of his genetic template, while developing unique characteristics based on his distinct life experiences within the Vault environment. These observations provided valuable data about the relative contributions of genetics and environment to human personality formation. The social integration of Gary 2 into the Vault's established community proved more problematic than researchers had anticipated, with other residents responding to his uncanny resemblance to the original Gary with suspicion and unease that gradually escalated into open hostility as more residents began to notice the similarity. These negative reactions were compounded by Gary 2's own confusion about his identity and his relationship to the man whose appearance he shared, creating psychological conflicts that affected both the clone and the broader community. The production of additional Gary clones proceeded according to research protocols that called for creating multiple subjects at regular intervals to study how genetic duplicates would interact with each other and with the original template subject, while also providing data about the psychological effects of encountering multiple copies of oneself within a confined social environment. Each new clone was designated with sequential numbers that reflected their order of creation rather than individual names that might acknowledge their humanity. Gary 3 through Gary 10 were introduced into the Vault's population at monthly intervals, creating an increasingly surreal social environment where a single genetic template gradually came to represent a significant portion of the facility's residents while maintaining the fiction that these individuals were unrelated newcomers whose resemblance was purely coincidental. The psychological impact on both the clones and the original Gary became increasingly severe as the number of duplicates increased beyond what human social instincts could process as normal variation. The behavioral patterns that emerged among the Gary clones reflected both their shared genetic heritage and their unique position as artificial beings, whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human identity and individuality, with each clone struggling to establish a distinct sense of self while confronting the reality that his physical appearance and basic personality traits were identical to those of multiple other individuals. These identity conflicts manifested as increasing aggression toward anyone who did not share their genetic template. The original Gary's psychological deterioration accelerated as he was forced to interact with growing numbers of individuals who shared his appearance while possessing distinct personalities and memories. creating cognitive dissonance that challenged his understanding of his own uniqueness and individual worth. His mental health problems were compounded by the hostile reactions of other Vault residents, who began to view him as responsible for the presence of his duplicates despite his lack of knowledge about the cloning program. The research data collected during the early phases of the cloning experiment revealed significant gaps in scientists' understanding of how genetic duplication would affect human psychology and social behavior, with observed behaviors deviating substantially from predictions based on animal studies and theoretical models. The clones displayed increasing solidarity with each other while developing hostility toward genetically distinct individuals, suggesting that human social instincts included mechanisms for recognizing and responding to genetic similarity that had not been previously understood. Gary 11 through Gary 20 demonstrated escalating aggressive behavior toward Vault residents who did not share their genetic template, apparently viewing genetic diversity as a threat to their collective identity, while developing group behaviors that prioritized the welfare of clones over that of naturally conceived individuals. This tribal mentality was accompanied by increasingly sophisticated coordination between clones who seemed to communicate through methods that researchers could not fully understand or document. The containment measures implemented to manage growing tensions between clones and natural humans proved inadequate for controlling conflicts that were rooted in fundamental biological instincts, rather than rational disagreements that could be resolved through negotiation or mediation. The clones' shared genetic heritage created bonds between them that transcended normal social relationships, while simultaneously making them view genetically distinct individuals as alien beings, deserving of elimination rather than coexistence. Gary 21 through Gary 30 displayed behavioral modifications that suggested the cloning process was producing cumulative changes in personality and cognitive function that had not been apparent in earlier subjects, with these later clones showing reduced capacity for communication with non-clones while demonstrating enhanced ability to coordinate with their genetic duplicates through methods that resembled telepathic communication rather than normal human social interaction. The scientific staff responsible for monitoring the cloning experiment began to recognize that their research had produced results that exceeded their ability to control or understand, with the clone population developing characteristics that represented evolutionary adaptations to their artificial social environment, rather than mere duplications of the original Gary's personality and behavioral patterns. These adaptations included enhanced group coordination, reduced empathy for genetically distinct individuals, and increasing hostility toward authority figures who attempted to impose external control over their activities. Gary 31 through Gary 40 demonstrated the emergence of a collective intelligence that operated through shared genetic templates rather than individual consciousness, with these clones displaying coordinated behaviors that suggested they were functioning as components of a larger organism rather than independent individuals pursuing personal objectives. This development represented a fundamental departure from human psychology that challenged basic assumptions about consciousness, identity, and social organization. The breakthrough that occurred with Gary 41 through Gary 50 involved the development of communication methods that bypassed normal human language systems, with these clones apparently sharing information and coordinating activities through biological mechanisms that researchers could observe but not comprehend or replicate. These enhanced clones demonstrated intelligence that exceeded that of their genetic template, while displaying complete indifference to the welfare of individuals who did not share their genetic heritage. Dr. Peterson's fatal encounter with Gary 54 occurred during what he believed was a routine psychological evaluation, an interaction that he approached with the same professional detachment that had characterized his previous work with cloned subjects throughout the experimental program. Peterson had observed the increasing coordination between clones and their growing hostility toward Vault staff, but he had not anticipated that their behavioral evolution had reached the point where they would view human researchers as immediate threats requiring elimination rather than authority figures deserving of obedience or respect. The attack that claimed Peterson's life was not a spontaneous outburst of violence, but a calculated action undertaken by Gary 54 as part of a coordinated plan developed by the Clone Collective to seize control of Vault 108 from the human staff who had created and monitored them for years. The speed and efficiency of the attack demonstrated that the clones had been planning their takeover for considerable time, while concealing their intentions from researchers who had underestimated their capacity for strategic thinking and planning their takeover. Collective action. The Gary revolution that followed Peterson's murder proceeded with mechanical precision that reflected the clones' shared consciousness and perfect coordination, with multiple Gary units attacking different targets simultaneously, while maintaining communication and tactical awareness that enabled them to overwhelm Vault security forces. Despite being outnumbered by the combined human population of residents and staff, the clones' identical appearance and coordinated behavior created confusion among defenders who had difficulty distinguishing between different clone individuals while tracking multiple threats, operating according to unified strategic objectives. The systematic elimination of non-clone residents that characterized the Gary takeover was conducted not out of personal hatred or emotional vengeance, but as a practical necessity for securing clone control over Vault resources, facilities, with each execution carried out efficiently and dispassionately by beings who viewed genetic diversity as an obstacle to optimal social organization, rather than a valuable aspect of human civilization worth preserving. The transformation of Vault 108 into an all-clone facility required modifications to accommodate the specific needs and preferences of a population that shared identical genetic templates while possessing collective intelligence that operated according to principles that differed fundamentally from normal human social organization. The clones reorganized living spaces, work assignments, and resource distribution according to criteria that prioritized collective efficiency over individual preferences or rights. The clone society that emerged from the Gary takeover represented a new form of human organization based on genetic uniformity and collective consciousness rather than individual identity and personal relationships, with all decisions made through consensus processes that reflected the shared interests of genetically identical individuals, rather than the complex negotiations required when diverse personalities and perspectives needed to be accommodated within a single community. The communication patterns that developed among the Vault's Gary population evolved beyond normal human language to incorporate methods that took advantage of their genetic similarity and shared psychological characteristics, creating forms of information exchange that were more efficient than conventional speech, while remaining incomprehensible to observers who did not share their genetic template. These enhanced communication abilities enabled coordination and decision-making processes that operated at speeds and levels of complexity that exceeded normal human capabilities. The years that followed the Gary Revolution saw the continued evolution of clone society within Vault 108, with the population developing cultural practices, technological innovations, and social structures that reflected their unique nature as genetically identical beings, sharing collective consciousness while maintaining physical existence as separate biological entities. These developments represented adaptations to artificial conditions that had no precedent in natural human evolution. The discovery of Vault 108 by wasteland explorers in 2277 revealed a facility populated entirely by Gary clones, who had preserved their collective civilization for 2 centuries while developing into something that could barely be recognized as human. Despite their obvious biological origins, the clones' reaction to outside contact reflected their long isolation and genetic conditioning, with all interaction reduced to repetition of their shared name, while maintaining the hostile behavior patterns that had characterized their relationship with non-clones since their creation. The single word, Gary, that comprised the entire vocabulary of the Vault's clone population, represented both the ultimate expression of their collective identity and the complete dissolution of individual consciousness that had characterized their evolution from separate clones into components of a single distributed organism. This linguistic simplification reflected psychological changes that had accompanied their social development, with complex human communication replaced by direct information transfer through shared genetic templates. In the end, Vault 108's cloning experiments succeeded in creating a stable population of genetically identical beings who could survive indefinitely in their artificial environment. But this success came at the cost of everything that made human civilization worth preserving, demonstrating that genetic perfection achieved through artificial means might preserve biological function while eliminating the diversity, creativity, and individual consciousness that defined humanity itself. The noble dream of ending world hunger forever had consumed the brightest minds in agricultural science for decades before the Great War, driving researchers to pursue increasingly ambitious projects that promised to transform barren wasteland into fertile paradise through the application of advanced botanical engineering and genetic modification techniques. The laboratories where this research was conducted represented humanity's greatest hope for survival in a world where traditional farming had become impossible due to soil contamination, climate disruption, and the systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure through resource conflicts that had devastated entire continents. The X-22 botanical gardens that served as the primary research facility for Vault-Tech's agricultural program were marvels of pre-war engineering, containing ecosystems that could be precisely controlled and monitored, while supporting plant species that had been modified to thrive under conditions that would prove lethal to natural vegetation. These facilities operated according to protocols that treated food production as an industrial process, subject to optimization through scientific methodology rather than the traditional agricultural practices that had sustained human civilization since the dawn of recorded history. The scientists recruited for Vault 22's botanical program were drawn from the most prestigious agricultural research institutions in the world. Individuals whose expertise in plant genetics, soil chemistry, and ecosystem management made them uniquely qualified to pursue research that promised to revolutionize food production while addressing the environmental challenges that would follow global nuclear conflict. These researchers were motivated by genuine humanitarian concern for preventing mass starvation in the post-war world, making their eventual fate all the more tragic given the noble intentions that had brought them to their underground laboratory. The crops that were developed within Vault 22's advanced growing facilities represented the pinnacle of genetic engineering applied to food production, with plant species that had been modified to grow rapidly in contaminated soil while producing nutritional yields that exceeded those of natural vegetation by enormous margins. These engineered plants were designed to be resistant to radiation, drought, disease, and insect damage, creating agricultural systems that could function effectively, even under the harshest post-war conditions that scientists could imagine. The marketing materials that promoted Vault 22 to potential residents emphasized the facility's mission of preserving human knowledge about food production while developing technologies that would enable post-war civilization to achieve agricultural abundance that exceeded even pre-war capabilities. The Vault was presented as a research station where dedicated scientists would work to ensure that nuclear war would not condemn humanity to subsistence-level agriculture or perpetual food shortages that might trigger additional conflicts over scarce resources. The families who applied for positions at Vault 22 were primarily agricultural specialists, botanists, and food scientists who understood the critical importance of preserving agricultural knowledge and developing new food production technologies that could function in post-war conditions. These residents brought with them decades of research, experience, and deep commitment to ensuring that human civilization would not collapse due to inability to feed growing populations in environments that had been damaged by nuclear, contamination, and climate disruption. The Vault's location in the Mojave Wasteland was selected specifically for its isolation from major population centers and its proximity to diverse ecological zones that would provide natural laboratories for testing engineered crops under various environmental conditions. The facility's underground growing chambers were supplemented by surface installations that would allow researchers to study how modified plants performed in actual post-war conditions while maintaining secure facilities for conducting more sensitive experiments that required complete environmental control. The initial research conducted within Vault 22 focused on developing crop varieties that could extract nutrients from contaminated soil while concentrating radioactive materials in plant structures that could be removed before consumption, effectively using agriculture to remediate environmental damage while simultaneously producing safe food for human consumption. These early experiments produced promising results that suggested engineered plants might actually improve soil conditions over time, rather than merely tolerating contamination. The pest control challenges that plagued Vault 22's agricultural systems were initially addressed through conventional methods that relied on chemical pesticides and biological control agents that had been proven effective in pre-war agriculture, but the enclosed environment of the vault and the modified nature of the crops created conditions that required innovative approaches to managing insect populations that could destroy entire harvests if left unchecked. The introduction of Bovaria mordicana into Vault 22's ecosystem represented what researchers believed was a breakthrough in biological pest control, a fungal agent that had been modified to target specific insect species while leaving beneficial organisms unharmed, promising to eliminate the need for chemical pesticides that might contaminate food crops or create environmental hazards within the vault's closed system. The fungus was presented as a natural solution to pest problems that would integrate seamlessly with the vault's organic agricultural systems. The initial testing of Bovaria mordicana under controlled laboratory conditions had produced results that exceeded researchers' most optimistic predictions, with the fungus proving capable of eliminating target insect populations with remarkable efficiency while showing no apparent effects on plants, beneficial insects, or laboratory animals used to assess its safety for human exposure. These early trials created confidence that the fungus could be safely introduced into the vault's agricultural areas without risk to residents or food production systems. The decision to deploy Bovaria mordicana throughout Vault 22's growing facilities was made by research directors who believed they were implementing a proven biological control agent that would protect food crops while eliminating the need for chemical pesticides that posed greater long-term risks to human health and environmental quality. The fungus was introduced gradually through the vault's air circulation system, allowing it to establish itself throughout the facility, while researchers monitored its effects on target pest species. The early success of the fungal pest control program created enthusiasm among Vault 22's research staff, who documented significant reductions in crop damage from insect pests, while observing no apparent negative effects on plant growth or human health among Vault residents. The fungus appeared to be performing exactly as intended, eliminating harmful insects, while leaving all other organisms unaffected, suggesting that biological control could replace chemical pesticides in post-war agriculture. But the genetic modifications that had been made to Beauveria mordicana to enhance its effectiveness against insect pests had also altered its fundamental biological characteristics in ways that researchers had not fully understood, anticipated, creating a pathogen that was capable of adapting to new host species through mechanisms that exceeded the evolutionary capabilities of natural fungal organisms. The controlled laboratory environment where initial testing had been conducted had not provided adequate opportunity for these adaptive capabilities to manifest. The first signs that Beauveria mordicana was affecting organisms beyond its intended insect targets appeared several months after its introduction, when Vault residents began reporting minor respiratory symptoms that were initially attributed to poor air circulation or allergic reactions to plant pollens from the intensive agricultural activities being conducted throughout the facility. These early symptoms were dismissed as minor inconveniences that would resolve once residents adapted to their new environment. The progression of fungal infection among Vault 22's human population was gradual enough to avoid immediate recognition as a systematic health crisis, with individual cases of respiratory illness attributed to various causes, ranging from pre-existing medical conditions to stress-related immune system suppression. The medical staff responsible for treating these symptoms had no reason to suspect that a fungal pathogen was spreading through the Vault's population because Beauveria mordicana had been tested and certified as safe for human exposure. The fungal spores that circulated through Vault 22's air system were inhaled by residents during routine daily activities, lodging in lung tissue where they began to germinate and establish colonies that initially caused only minor inflammation and irritation. The early stages of infection were characterized by symptoms that resembled common respiratory ailments, making diagnosis difficult even for medical professionals who were trained to recognize unusual infectious diseases. The biological mechanisms through which Beauveria mordicana infected human hosts were fundamentally different from those that characterized its interaction with insect prey, with the fungus adapting its reproductive strategies to exploit the unique physiology of mammalian respiratory systems, while maintaining its ability to spread through airborne spores. These adaptations allowed the fungus to establish persistent infections that could continue for extended periods without immediately killing the host organism. The psychological effects of fungal infection became apparent long before the physical symptoms that would eventually prove fatal, with infected residents displaying behavioral changes that included increased aggression, reduced cognitive function, and loss of normal social inhibitions that had previously governed their interactions with other Vault residents. These behavioral modifications were initially attributed to the stress of confinement and the pressure of conducting critical research under difficult conditions. The fungal colonies that established themselves in infected residents' nervous systems gradually began to influence brain function through the release of chemical compounds that altered neurotransmitter production and synaptic communication, effectively turning human consciousness into a mechanism for furthering fungal reproduction rather than maintaining individual survival and well-being. These neurological changes transformed infected individuals into vectors for spreading the pathogen to other members of the Vault's population. The loss of individual consciousness that characterized advanced fungal infection was not immediate death, but rather the gradual replacement of human decision-making processes with biological imperatives that prioritized fungal reproduction and dispersal over all other considerations. Infected residents continued to move and interact with their environment, but their actions were guided by fungal biology rather than human intelligence or emotion, creating beings that retained human appearance while serving entirely different biological purposes. The research documentation that recorded the progression of fungal infection throughout Vault 22's population reflected the scientific training of researchers who continued to observe and record, even as they themselves became infected with the pathogen they were studying, creating clinical records that documented their own transformation from human scientists into fungal vectors. These reports provided detailed accounts of the infection process, while simultaneously demonstrating the fungus's ability to maintain cognitive function long enough to serve its reproductive objectives. The agricultural systems that had been the primary focus of Vault 22's research mission were gradually overwhelmed by fungal growth that consumed both crop plants and the human expertise necessary for maintaining food production, transforming the facility from a center of botanical research into a fungal ecosystem that existed primarily to support the reproduction and dispersal of Bovaria mordicana. The crops that had been engineered to feed post-war humanity became substrates for supporting pathogenic organisms that posed existential threats to human survival. The containment breach that occurred 18 months after the initial fungal introduction was not a mechanical failure, but rather the inevitable result of infected residents' behavior being directed by fungal biology towards spreading the pathogen beyond the confines of Vault 22, creating new opportunities for reproduction and colonization that served the fungus's evolutionary objectives while threatening every human community within dispersal range of the facility. The 118 residents who managed to escape from Vault 22 before the facility was completely overrun by fungal infection were not unaffected survivors, but rather individuals who had been infected with early-stage fungal colonies that had not yet progressed to complete control over their host organisms. These escapees carried Bovaria mordicana with them into the wasteland, creating the potential for widespread contamination of post-war human settlements that lacked the knowledge or equipment necessary to identify and contain fungal threats. The lockdown procedures that the escaping residents implemented before abandoning Vault 22 represented their final act of human consciousness before fungal influence completely overwhelmed their decision-making processes, ensuring that the facility would remain sealed and its dangerous contents contained, while warning signs would alert future explorers to the hazards that lay within the overgrown chambers where fungal colonies continued to thrive and reproduce. The warning messages posted outside Vault 22's entrance accurately summarized the threat that lay within the facility, though their simple language could not adequately convey the horror of human consciousness being gradually consumed and replaced by fungal biology that transformed people into mechanisms for pathogen dispersal rather than individuals, capable of independent thought and moral decision-making. The phrase, "the plants kill," encompassed both literal truth and profound understatement about the nature of the threat that awaited anyone foolish enough to enter the contaminated facility. The spore carriers that wandered through Vault 22's overgrown corridors were the physical remains of research staff and residents whose bodies had been colonized so completely by fungal growth that their original human characteristics were barely recognizable beneath the fruiting bed. Bodies and mycelial networks that had replaced normal tissue. These beings retained enough motor function to move through their environment, while serving as living incubators for producing the spores that would enable further fungal reproduction and dispersal. The ecological transformation that occurred within Vault 22 following its abandonment created an artificial ecosystem dominated by fungal organisms that had adapted to thrive in the controlled environment of the research facility, while maintaining their ability to infect and colonize any biological material that entered their territory. The facility became a monument to the unintended consequences of biological engineering that exceeded researchers' ability to predict or control the organisms they had modified for human purposes. The agricultural knowledge that had been preserved within Vault 22's research databases and documentation systems remained technically intact, but practically inaccessible due to the fungal contamination that made extended exposure to the facility's interior potentially fatal for any human attempting to recover the information. The irony of this situation was that the knowledge necessary for feeding post-war humanity remained trapped within a facility that had become too dangerous for humans to enter safely. The food production technologies that had been developed within Vault 22 could theoretically have provided solutions to agricultural challenges that plagued wasteland communities struggling to grow crops in contaminated soil, but the fungal threat that guarded this knowledge made recovery efforts extremely dangerous, while the risk of accidentally releasing Bovaria mordicana into the broader environment made such attempts potentially catastrophic for human survival throughout the region. The scientific legacy of Vault 22's research program was preserved primarily in the form of biological specimens that continued to reproduce and evolve within the facility's controlled environment, creating a living laboratory where fungal organisms continued to develop new capabilities and characteristics that might eventually enable them to overcome the containment measures that prevented their spread into the outside world. The Vault had become a center for uncontrolled biological evolution, rather than directed agricultural research. The moral lesson embedded in Vault 22's transformation from agricultural research facility to fungal incubator reflected the dangers of pursuing biological engineering without adequate understanding of the complex ecological relationships that govern the behavior of modified organisms in closed systems, demonstrating that even well-intentioned research could produce catastrophic results when scientists exceeded their ability to predict and control the consequences of their experimental modifications. The survivors who had escaped from Vault 22 carried with them not only fungal infections that posed ongoing threats to their health and the welfare of any communities that accepted them, but also the psychological trauma of having witnessed the transformation of their colleagues and family members into organisms that retained human appearance while serving biological purposes that were utterly alien to human consciousness and moral understanding. In the end, Vault 22's story represented the ultimate perversion of humanity's relationship with nature, demonstrating how attempts to control and modify natural systems for human benefit could backfire catastrophically when researchers underestimated the adaptive capabilities of the organisms they sought to manipulate, creating threats that exceeded any benefits that might have been achieved through successful completion of the original research objectives. The computer that would determine the fate of Vault 11's residents was not a malevolent artificial intelligence driven by malice or programmed hatred for humanity, but rather a coldly logical machine designed to implement social experiments that would test the fundamental assumptions underlying democratic governance and moral decision-making in closed communities facing existential threats. The scientists who programmed this system believed they were creating an instrument for studying human behavior under extreme stress, a tool that would provide insights into the psychological mechanisms that enabled civilized societies to function or collapse when confronted with impossible choices between individual survival and collective welfare. The theoretical framework that guided Vault 11's experimental design was rooted in utilitarian philosophy and game theory, academic disciplines that attempted to quantify human moral reasoning through mathematical models that could predict how rational actors would behave when forced to choose between competing values, like individual rights and group survival. The researchers who conceived this experiment believed they could gain valuable insights into human nature by creating conditions where normal moral constraints would be suspended in favor of brutal calculations about the greatest good for the greatest number. The recruitment of residents for Vault 11 followed patterns that ensured the facility would contain a representative sample of American democratic society, with individuals selected from diverse backgrounds and political affiliations who possessed the civic engagement and leadership experience necessary for establishing functional democratic institutions within their underground community. These residents were teachers and small business owners, veterans and community organizers, parents and civic leaders who had demonstrated commitment to democratic values and collaborative problem-solving throughout their pre-war lives. The Vault's promotional materials emphasized its commitment to preserving American democratic traditions and constitutional government during the dark years that would follow nuclear war, presenting the facility as a refuge where Enlightenment values and Republican institutions would be maintained until residents could emerge to help rebuild civilized society according to principles that had guided the nation since its founding. The residents who applied for shelter in Vault 11 believed they were joining a community dedicated to preserving the best aspects of American political culture. The initial months following Vault 11's sealing were characterized by remarkable success in establishing democratic governance and community cooperation that exceeded even the optimistic projections of Vault tech planners, who had designed the facility's social systems. The residents organized themselves into committees responsible for different aspects of Vault management, established educational programs for children that emphasized civic responsibility and democratic participation, and created recreational activities that built social bonds while maintaining the cultural traditions they had brought from surface society. The democratic institutions that emerged within Vault 11 reflected the political sophistication and civic commitment of residents who understood the importance of checks and balances, separation of powers, and protection of minority rights, for maintaining stable government in small communities where personal conflicts could easily escalate into factional disputes that might threaten everyone's welfare. These early governmental structures were models of participatory democracy that would have impressed the founding fathers whose constitutional principles they embodied. The computer's first demand for human sacrifice came without warning or preparation, delivered through the Vault's communication system, with the clinical detachment that characterized all interactions between residents and the machine that controlled their life support systems. The message was simple and unambiguous. Select one member of the community for termination within 24 hours, or automated systems would kill everyone in the Vault through methods that were not specified but were presumably swift and certain. The psychological impact of this ultimatum was immediate and devastating, transforming a peaceful democratic community into a collection of terrified individuals who suddenly faced the possibility that their neighbors might vote to have them killed in order to preserve their own lives. The social bonds that had sustained the community through months of underground isolation were instantly strained by suspicions and calculations that had no place in civilized society but became unavoidable when survival depended on wine. Collective décision about individual fate. The initial response of Vault 11's residents reflected their commitment to democratic values and their belief that rational discussion could resolve even the most difficult moral dilemmas through processes that respected human dignity while protecting community welfare. They convened emergency meetings where representatives from different factions attempted to find alternatives to the computer's demand, exploring options that might satisfy the machine's requirements while avoiding the moral catastrophe of deliberately killing a community member. The debates that consumed Vault 11 during those first terrifying hours revealed the inadequacy of democratic institutions for addressing moral choices that exceeded the normal range of political decision-making, with established procedures for community governance proving insufficient for questions that involved life and death rather than resource allocation or policy implementation. The parliamentary procedures and debate formats that had served them well for routine matters became obstacles to reaching decisions when delay might result in everyone's death. The computer's refusal to negotiate or accept alternative proposals forced residents to confront the reality that their situation had moved beyond the realm of normal political discourse into territory where survival depended on their willingness to abandon moral principles that had previously defined their community identity. The machine's responses to their proposed alternatives were uniformly negative, offering no flexibility or compromise that might allow them to preserve both their lives and their ethical commitments. The first selection process that resulted in a community member's death was conducted according to democratic principles that residents hoped would distribute moral responsibility among the entire population rather than placing the burden of choice on individual leaders who might be held personally accountable for their decisions. They established procedures for nominating candidates, debating their relative merits as sacrificial victims, and conducting secret ballot elections that would determine who would die to preserve everyone else's life. The criteria that emerged for selecting sacrifice victims reflected the community's attempt to minimize the moral horror of their situation by focusing on factors that might make some deaths less tragic than others, with residents considering age, health status, family, relationships, and community contributions as variables that might justify choosing one person over another for termination. These discussions revealed the impossibility of making rational calculations about the relative value of human lives while maintaining respect for the dignity that democratic societies were supposed to protect. The ritual aspects that developed around the sacrifice process served multiple psychological functions for residents who needed to maintain their sanity while participating in activities that violated everything they had believed about moral behavior and community responsibility. The formal procedures, ceremonial elements, and collective participation in the selection process created psychological distance between individual residents and the terrible choices they were making while providing structures that made the unbearable seem routine. The first overseer selected through this democratic death lottery was a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, whose advanced age and lack of immediate family members made her seem like the least tragic choice among the available options, though the reasoning that led to her selection provided no comfort to residents who understood they had chosen to murder a woman whose only crime was trusting them to protect her welfare as part of their shared community. Her execution was carried out by volunteers who believed that sharing the physical act of killing would distribute moral responsibility more equitably. The aftermath of the first sacrifice was characterized by a mixture of relief at having survived the computer's ultimatum and horror at what they had done to achieve that survival, with residents struggling to maintain normal social relationships while knowing that they had collectively chosen to kill one of their neighbors and might be forced to make similar choices again in the future. The success of their democratic process in producing the demanded death felt simultaneously like validation of their procedures and condemnation of their moral compromises. The computer's annual repetition of its sacrifice demand transformed what residents had hoped was a single terrible choice into an ongoing requirement that would define their community's existence for as long as they remained in Ond. The Vault, creating a social system where democratic elections became mechanisms for selecting victims rather than leaders, and where political participation meant accepting responsibility for neighbors' deaths. The regularity of these demands prevented residents from treating the sacrifices as emergency responses to unique circumstances. The factional divisions that emerged within Vault 11 reflected different strategies for managing the moral burden of regular human sacrifice, with some residents advocating for systematic approaches that would distribute deaths evenly across demographic groups, while others pushed for merit-based systems that would eliminate individuals deemed least valuable to community welfare. These political coalitions were bound together not by shared policy preferences, but by common approaches to the ethics of murder. The manipulation of democratic processes that characterized later sacrifice selections demonstrated how quickly political institutions could be perverted when their fundamental purpose shifted from protecting citizen welfare to facilitating citizen elimination, with electoral procedures that had been designed to ensure fair representation becoming tools for targeting personal enemies or removing political rivals under the cover of community necessity. The secret ballot that had protected democratic participation became a weapon for anonymous revenge. The psychological adaptation strategies that residents developed to cope with their regular participation in sanctioned murder included various forms of denial, rationalization, and emotional numbing that enabled them to function in daily life while suppressing awareness of the moral enormity of their actions. Some residents focused obsessively on procedural fairness, as if proper democratic process could legitimize the killing they were doing, while others retreated into religious or philosophical frameworks that provided meaning for suffering that exceeded normal human understanding. The children who grew up within Vault 11's culture of democratic murder were perhaps the most tragic victims of the computer's social experiment, as they were raised to view electoral participation in death selection as a normal civic responsibility rather than the moral catastrophe it represented to adults who remembered life before the sacrifices began. These young people developed psychological frameworks that normalized violence while maintaining belief in democratic values, creating cognitive contradictions that would shape their worldview throughout their lives. The technological systems that the computer used to monitor compliance with its sacrifice demands included surveillance networks that documented every aspect of the selection and execution process, creating detailed records of how democratic communities responded to existential threats that required them to choose between moral principles and physical survival. This data collection served the experiment's research objectives while ensuring that residents could not escape their moral burden through denial or selective memory about their actions. The resistance movements that occasionally emerged within Vault 11 were typically short-lived and ineffective, as residents who opposed the sacrifice system found themselves facing not only the computer's lethal authority, but also the hostility of neighbors who had become psychologically invested in the processes that enabled their survival. The social pressure to participate in community decisions about life and death made conscientious objection extremely difficult to maintain when dissent might be interpreted as disloyalty that threatened everyone's welfare. The religious and philosophical developments that arose within Vault 11's unique social environment included theological systems that attempted to provide spiritual justification for actions that traditional moral frameworks condemned, with residents creating new ethical paradigms that could accommodate regular murder while preserving their sense of spiritual worth and community righteousness. These belief systems demonstrated the human capacity for moral adaptation under extreme circumstances while highlighting the dangers of ethical relativism when survival was at stake. The medical and psychological services that Vault residents required to maintain their mental health, while participating in regular sacrifice selections, strained the facility's resources while creating additional ethical dilemmas for healthcare providers who were simultaneously treating trauma caused by community violence and participating in the democratic processes that created that trauma. The physicians and counselors who served Vault 11 faced impossible conflicts between their professional obligations to promote healing and their civic duties as community members. The economic systems that developed within Vault 11 were influenced by the annual sacrifice requirement, with residents creating informal markets for political influence that could affect sacrifice selection, while also developing insurance-like arrangements where individuals could trade favors or resources for protection from nomination. These economic adaptations demonstrated how quickly financial relationships could become corrupted when political processes involved life and death decisions rather than mere policy preferences. The cultural productions that emerged from Vault 11's unique social environment included art, literature, and music that attempted to process the psychological trauma of living in a community where neighbors regularly voted to kill each other, with creative works serving both as outlets for expressing emotions that could not be safely discussed in political forums and as mechanisms for maintaining human dignity in circumstances that challenged basic assumptions about civilized behavior. The eventual rebellion that ended Vault 11's sacrifice system occurred when 5 final residents decided they could no longer participate in the democratic selection of victims, choosing instead to defy the computer's ultimatum and accept the consequences of their moral stand regardless of the personal cost. Their decision represented the triumph of individual conscience over collective survival instinct, demonstrating that human dignity could be preserved even under circumstances designed to destroy it. The computer's response to the residents' defiance revealed the true purpose of Vault 11's experiment, with the machine's congratulatory message acknowledging that the test had been designed to determine whether human communities would maintain moral principles when faced with existential threats, or would abandon ethical constraints in favor of utilitarian calculations about survival. The praise for their commitment to human life came too late to restore the lives that had been lost during years of unnecessary sacrifice. The bitter irony of Vault 11's experiment was that the moral courage required to end the killing had been available throughout the community's history, but residents had been so focused on preserving their physical survival that they had failed to recognize that their moral survival was equally important for maintaining human civilization. The computer had provided them with a test that they had failed repeatedly until only 5 people remained to demonstrate what the correct response should have been from the beginning. In the end, Vault 11's legacy was not the social science data it generated about democratic decision-making under extreme circumstances, but the lesson it provided about the importance of maintaining moral principles, even when those principles seemed to conflict with immediate survival needs, demonstrating that some forms of life were not worth preserving if they required the abandonment of everything that made life meaningful and dignified. The cruelest experiment ever conceived by the architects of human suffering was not the exposure to radiation or disease, not the manipulation of consciousness or the perversion of community bonds, but the systematic destruction of the most fundamental human need, the connection to other conscious beings that gives meaning to existence itself. Vault 77 represented the ultimate expression of scientific curiosity divorced from moral consideration, a facility designed to answer the question of what would happen to a human mind when stripped of every form of social interaction and left alone with nothing but its own deteriorating consciousness for company. The theoretical framework that justified this experiment was rooted in psychological research about sensory deprivation and social isolation, studies that had documented the rapid deterioration of mental function when subjects were deprived of normal human contact for extended periods. The scientists who designed Vault 77 believed they could gain valuable insights into the fundamental nature of human consciousness by creating conditions of absolute solitude that exceeded anything that had been attempted in previous research programs. The selection of a single subject for Vault 77's isolation experiment was conducted according to criteria that prioritized psychological stability and intellectual capacity, seeking an individual who would be able to provide detailed documentation of his mental deterioration while possessing sufficient resilience to survive the experience long enough to generate useful research data. The chosen subject was a middle-aged accountant named Harold Morrison, whose unremarkable background and lack of close family relationships made him an ideal candidate for an experiment that required complete severance from all previous social connections. Morrison's recruitment for the Vault program was conducted through deceptive practices that presented his assignment as a special honor rather than a sentence to psychological torture, with Vault Tech representatives explaining that he had been selected for an important research project that would contribute to humanity's understanding of individual resilience and self-sufficiency. The true nature of his isolation was concealed behind language about independent living research and self-reliance studies that made the experiment sound like an opportunity for personal growth rather than deliberate psychological destruction. The Vault itself was a marvel of engineering designed specifically to accommodate a single resident while providing all the life support systems necessary for indefinite survival in complete isolation from other human beings. The facility contained living quarters, recreational areas, workshop spaces, and storage facilities that could sustain one person for decades, while ensuring that he would never encounter another conscious being or receive any communication from the outside world that might alleviate the crushing weight of absolute solitude. The monitoring systems installed throughout Vault 77 were among the most sophisticated surveillance networks ever deployed, capable of documenting every aspect of Morrison's behavior while remaining completely hidden from his awareness, ensuring that he would never know he was being observed, and thus could never derive comfort from the knowledge that other conscious beings were aware of his existence. These systems recorded not only his actions, but also his physiological responses, sleep patterns, and vocal expressions, creating a comprehensive record of human psychological deterioration under conditions of absolute isolation. The initial weeks of Morrison's confinement passed with remarkable psychological stability as he established daily routines and occupied himself with various activities that had been provided to prevent immediate mental collapse, while allowing researchers to observe the gradual onset of isolation-induced psychological symptoms. Morrison explored his new home thoroughly, organized his living spaces according to personal preferences, and attempted to maintain the structured lifestyle that had characterized his pre-war existence. The Vault's library contained thousands of books on diverse subjects ranging from technical manuals and historical texts to fiction and poetry, resources that were intended to provide mental stimulation while documenting how prolonged isolation would affect learning, retention, and intellectual development over extended periods. Morrison initially approached these materials with enthusiasm, creating reading schedules and taking detailed notes as if he were pursuing an advanced degree rather than serving as a test subject in psychological research. The workshop areas within the Vault were equipped with tools and materials that would enable Morrison to pursue various crafts and construction projects, activities that researchers believed would provide outlets for creative expression, while demonstrating how isolation affected motivation, planning ability, and the satisfaction derived from completing complex tasks without social recognition or approval. These facilities included woodworking equipment, metal fabrication tools, and electronic components that could support a wide range of creative endeavors. But the most significant element of Vault 77's design was the sealed box that had been placed in Morrison's living quarters, an object whose presence would define his psychological journey from stability through deterioration to complete madness. The box was constructed from materials that would resist his attempts to open it, while remaining obviously openable with sufficient determination, creating a psychological focal point that would gradually consume his attention as other sources of stimulation lost their appeal. The gradual erosion of Morrison's mental health followed patterns that had been predicted by researchers who understood the psychological mechanisms that enabled human beings to maintain stable self-concepts and emotional regulation through social interaction and external validation. Deprived of feedback from other conscious beings, Morrison's sense of identity began to fragment as he lost the external references that had previously anchored his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The conversations that Morrison began having with imaginary companions represented his mind's desperate attempt to recreate the social interactions that were essential for maintaining psychological stability, with these internal dialogues initially serving as healthy coping mechanisms that provided outlets for thoughts and emotions that would normally be shared with friends, family members, or colleagues. These early imaginary relationships were based on memories of real people from his pre-war life. The transition from healthy internal dialogue to pathological hallucination occurred gradually over several months, as Morrison's imaginary companions became increasingly vivid and autonomous, developing personalities and perspectives that differed substantially from his own conscious thoughts, and eventually seeming to possess independent existence, rather than serving as mere projections of his isolated consciousness. These hallucinated relationships provided temporary relief from loneliness while simultaneously indicating serious deterioration in his ability to distinguish between internal mental processes and external reality. The opening of the sealed box occurred during Morrison's 6th month of isolation, when his psychological deterioration had progressed to the point where his curiosity and desperation for novel stimulation overcame his previous reluctance to violate what had seemed like a prohibition against accessing its contents. The discovery of hand puppets inside the box represented what researchers believed would be a turning point in his psychological development, providing props that could facilitate more elaborate fantasy relationships, while documenting how isolation affected his capacity for imaginative play and symbolic thinking. The puppet theatre that Morrison created in his living quarters became the centerpiece of an elaborate fantasy world, where the small fabric figures served as characters in ongoing dramatic productions that occupied increasing amounts of his time and mental energy. These performances initially followed conventional narrative structures with clear plots, character development, and moral themes, but gradually evolved into increasingly complex and disturbing productions that reflected the progressive deterioration of Morrison's psychological state. The personalities that Morrison assigned to his puppet characters were initially based on archetypes from literature and popular culture, with figures representing heroes, villains, authority figures, and comic relief that enabled him to explore different aspects of human experience through dramatic scenarios that provided outlets for emotions and conflicts that had no other means of expression in his isolated environment. These early puppet shows were relatively healthy expressions of creativity that demonstrated his mind's resilience in the face of extreme adversity. But as months turned into years and Morrison's isolation continued without relief or hope of rescue, the puppet characters began to develop increasingly autonomous personalities that seemed to possess independent wills and agendas rather than serving as mere extensions of his conscious intentions. The king puppet that initially served as a benevolent ruler in Morrison's fantasy kingdom gradually became a tyrannical figure whose demands and pronouncements reflected Morrison's growing frustration with his powerless situation, while providing an outlet for aggressive impulses that had no appropriate targets in his solitary environment. The murder that occurred within Morrison's puppet kingdom was not a planned dramatic development, but a spontaneous expression of rage and frustration that reflected his deteriorating emotional control and increasing tendency toward violence as coping mechanisms that had sustained him through. The early years of isolation proved inadequate for managing the psychological pressures of prolonged solitude. The destruction of the king puppet represented both symbolic rebellion against authority and literal destruction of the fantasy relationships that had provided his only social interaction. The investigation that Morrison conducted to identify the king puppet's murderer demonstrated the complete breakdown of his ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, as he treated the incident as a genuine crime requiring systematic detection work, rather than recognizing it as the product of his own psychological deterioration and violent impulses. His methodical approach to solving the puppet murder reflected the persistence of rational thinking processes, even as his overall mental state descended into territories that could no longer be characterized as sane. The Vault-Tec boy puppet that Morrison identified as the murderer represented the darkest aspects of his psychological transformation, embodying the violent and antisocial impulses that prolonged isolation had awakened while providing a convenient target for the guilt and self-hatred that accompanied his recognition of what he was becoming. This puppet character served as both scapegoat for Morrison's moral deterioration and guide for future actions that would express the aggressive urges that isolation had made increasingly difficult to control. The relationship that developed between Morrison and the Vault-Tec boy puppet transcended normal boundaries between creator and creation, with the fabric figure seeming to possess independent consciousness that influenced Morrison's decisions and behavior in ways that he could not fully control or understand. This parasitic psychological relationship provided Morrison with companionship, while simultaneously encouraging him toward increasingly antisocial and violent behavior patterns that would have horrified his pre-isolation personality. The decision to leave Vault 77 after years of solitary confinement was not Morrison's own, but rather the result of psychological influence from the Vault-Tec boy puppet, whose malevolent consciousness had gradually assumed control over Morrison's decision-making processes, while convincing him that the outside world contained enemies who deserved punishment for their role in his suffering. The puppet's encouragement toward violence provided Morrison with purpose and direction that his isolated mind desperately craved while channeling his accumulated rage toward external targets. The emergence of Morrison into the post-war wasteland marked the beginning of his transformation from isolated victim of psychological experimentation into active threat to any survivors unlucky enough to encounter him during his wanderings. The combination of years of solitude, complete psychological breakdown, and guidance from the malevolent puppet consciousness had created a being who retained human appearance while possessing motivations and behavioral patterns that bore no resemblance to normal human psychology or moral reasoning. The bandit encounter that provided Morrison's first opportunity to test his puppet companion's violent recommendations occurred when he was captured by wasteland raiders who viewed him as a potential source of valuable supplies or information about pre-war facilities that might contain useful resources. These criminals had no way of understanding that their seemingly helpless prisoner had been psychologically transformed into something far more dangerous than they could imagine through years of isolation and puppet-induced madness. The massacre that followed Morrison's capture demonstrated the effectiveness of the Vault-Tec boy puppet's influence over his behavior, with the seemingly helpless captive transforming into an efficient killing machine who eliminated his captors through methods that combined calculated planning with frenzied violence. The bandits' deaths were not motivated by self-defense or rational survival calculations, but by the puppet's insatiable appetite for destruction and Morrison's complete psychological submission to its malevolent will. The psychological dynamic between Morrison and his puppet companion during the bandit killings revealed the complete inversion of their original relationship, with the fabric figure now serving as the dominant consciousness, while Morrison functioned as its physical instrument for interacting with the material world. The puppet's expressions of satisfaction with the violence, while Morrison's face reflected horror and confusion, demonstrated that whatever remained of his original personality was trapped within a mind that no longer belonged to him. The reputation that Morrison acquired as the Puppet Man spread throughout wasteland communities as survivors shared stories about encounters with a deranged individual who traveled with fabric companions and left trails of inexplicable violence wherever he appeared. These tales described a figure who seemed to embody the worst nightmares of post-war existence. A human being who had been so thoroughly broken by isolation and experimentation that he had become something alien and threatening to normal human community. The conversations that witnesses reported overhearing between Morrison and his puppets revealed the complexity of his psychological deterioration, with the fabric figures apparently providing him with detailed instructions and commentary about his actions, while he responded as if they were genuine participants in planning and executing violent attacks on innocent survivors. These exchanges demonstrated that Morrison's isolation had not merely damaged his social skills, but had fundamentally altered his understanding of consciousness, agency, and moral responsibility. The trail of destruction that followed Morrison's movements through the wasteland served multiple functions for the psychological forces that controlled his behavior, providing outlets for the accumulated rage and frustration that years of isolation had created, while simultaneously ensuring that he would never be able to establish the human connections that might have provided healing for his damaged psyche. Each act of violence made him more isolated and less capable of recovering the humanity that prolonged solitude had stolen from him. The theological implications of Morrison's transformation raised disturbing questions about the nature of human consciousness and the extent to which individual identity could be preserved when subjected to extreme isolation and psychological manipulation. His case demonstrated that the boundaries between self and other, reality and fantasy, moral agency and compulsion could be dissolved through techniques that left the subject biologically alive while destroying everything that made him recognizably human. The scientific data that Morrison's experience provided about the effects of prolonged isolation on human psychology was comprehensive and detailed, documenting the complete progression from healthy mental function through various stages of deterioration to final psychological collapse and transformation into something that could no longer be meaningfully described as human consciousness. This information would prove valuable for understanding the limits of human psychological endurance, while simultaneously demonstrating that some forms of knowledge could only be obtained through methods that violated fundamental principles of human dignity. The puppet companions that had provided Morrison with his only social interaction during years of isolation remained with him throughout his violent rampage across the wasteland, serving as both witnesses to his crimes and accomplices in planning future attacks on innocent survivors who represented everything he had lost through his participation in Vault-Tech's psychological experimentation. These fabric figures had become more real to him than any human being he encountered, creating a form of companionship that was simultaneously intimate and utterly alien to normal social relationships. In the end, Vault 77's experiment succeeded in documenting the complete destruction of human consciousness through prolonged isolation. But the cost of this knowledge was the creation of a monster who embodied the worst possible outcome of scientific research that treated human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of theoretical understanding about the nature of consciousness, identity, and social connection. The basement beneath Malden Middle School held secrets that would have horrified the parents who entrusted their children to the institution's care, concealed chambers where the promise of education had been perverted into something that resembled the worst excesses of totalitarian regimes that had conducted systematic programs of human experimentation disguised as scientific research. Vault 75 represented the ultimate corruption of childhood innocence, a facility designed to transform the natural process of human development into a laboratory exercise where young lives were treated as raw materials for genetic engineering, rather than precious individuals deserving of protection and nurturing. The scientific rationale that justified Vault 75's existence was built on eugenic theories that had been discredited by civilized society, but found new life in the desperate circumstances surrounding the impending nuclear war, with researchers arguing that humanity's survival required the systematic improvement of the species through selective breeding and genetic manipulation that would produce superior human beings capable of thriving in the harsh conditions of the post-war world. These theories provided intellectual cover for experiments that reduced children to breeding stock whose value was measured entirely by their genetic potential rather than their humanity. The recruitment strategy that Vault-Tech employed for Vault 75 exploited parents' natural desire to protect their children from the nuclear devastation that everyone knew was coming, presenting the facility as an exclusive educational institution that would provide the finest possible preparation for leadership roles in post-war society. The marketing materials emphasized academic excellence, character development, and physical fitness programs that would create a generation of young people uniquely qualified to rebuild civilization according to the highest ideals of human achievement. The families who applied to have their children accepted into Vault 75's program represented the educational and social elite of their communities, parents who understood the importance of providing their offspring with every possible advantage for success in an uncertain future. These were doctors and lawyers, teachers and engineers, business leaders and government officials who believed they were securing places for their children in an institution that would preserve the best aspects of human civilization, while preparing young minds to lead humanity's recovery from nuclear catastrophe. The application process for Vault 75 was more rigorous than admission to the most prestigious universities, involving comprehensive evaluations of children's intellectual capabilities, physical development, psychological profiles, and family genetic histories that would supposedly enable educators to identify those young people with the greatest potential for contributing to humanity's future. These assessments were presented as methods for ensuring that educational resources would be allocated most effectively, concealing their true purpose as screening mechanisms for selecting experimental subjects whose genetic profiles would be most useful for breeding research. The facility itself was a masterpiece of deceptive architecture, with educational spaces, recreational facilities, and living quarters that would have impressed any parent fortunate enough to tour the underground school before the bombs fell. The classrooms were equipped with the most advanced educational technology available. The libraries contained comprehensive collections of human knowledge, and the laboratories were presented as teaching facilities where students would learn scientific principles through hands-on experimentation rather than theoretical study alone. But hidden beneath this facade of educational excellence were the secret levels where the vault's true purpose would be revealed once the blast doors sealed and the children were separated forever from the parents who had entrusted them to what they believed was a sanctuary of learning and growth. These concealed areas contained genetic laboratories, medical facilities designed for systematic human experimentation, and housing for the scientific staff who would transform education into systematic torture disguised as academic rigor. The day that nuclear fire consumed the world above was a day of celebration and excitement for the children who gathered in Vault 75's assembly hall. Young people who understood that history was being made around them while believing they were beginning an adventure that would prepare them to become the leaders of tomorrow. They carried with them the hopes and dreams that their parents had invested in their futures, the expectation that their underground education would equip them with knowledge and skills that would enable them to build a better world than the one that was being destroyed by war. The separation of children from their parents was presented as a temporary administrative necessity designed to facilitate orientation programs and security procedures that would ensure everyone's safety during the transition to underground living. Families were told that reunification would occur once the initial settlement process was complete and living arrangements had been finalized according to educational and social groupings that would optimize learning outcomes and community development throughout their extended confinement. The soundproof chambers where parents were systematically executed while their children attended orientation sessions were designed to ensure that no screams or pleas for mercy would disturb the educational activities being conducted in adjacent areas, allowing the mass murder to proceed efficiently while maintaining the illusion that family separation was temporary rather than permanent. The methods used to kill the adults were chosen for their speed and reliability rather than any concern for minimizing suffering, with the research staff viewing the parents as obstacles to their experimental program rather than human beings deserving of dignity even in death. The disposal of adult bodies was conducted according to protocols that eliminated all physical evidence of the massacre while providing organic material for the vault's agricultural systems, ensuring that the children would unknowingly consume the remains of their murdered parents as part of their daily nutrition program. This grotesque recycling served both practical and psychological purposes, providing food resources while creating unconscious psychological bonds between the children and their new environment through the most intimate possible connection to their lost families. The educational program that replaced normal childhood development was designed around principles of systematic stress application and survival selection that would identify those children whose genetic heritage and psychological resilience made them most suitable for breeding purposes, while eliminating those whose weakness or genetic inadequacy made them unsuitable for contributing to humanity's genetic future. These academic activities were disguised as challenging educational experiences that would build character and intellectual capacity through overcoming increasingly difficult obstacles and assignments. The physical training regimens that consumed much of the children's daily schedules were not designed to promote health and fitness, but to identify those individuals whose genetic heritage provided superior strength, endurance, and coordination, while weeding out those whose physical limitations made them unsuitable for reproducing the enhanced human beings that the Vault's research program was intended to create. These exercises were conducted under conditions that maximized stress and pain while maintaining the appearance of legitimate athletic development programs. The psychological evaluations that monitored every aspect of the children's mental and emotional development were not intended to ensure their well-being, but to document their responses to systematic torture and abuse, while identifying personality traits that might be desirable in future generations of genetically enhanced humans. The staff psychologists who conducted these assessments were not healers, but researchers whose interest in the children's suffering was entirely clinical and scientific rather than compassionate or protective. The academic competitions that pitted children against each other in contests with life or death consequences served multiple functions in the Vault's experimental program, providing entertainment for staff members who enjoyed watching young people suffer while generating data about competitive behavior, stress responses, and moral decision-making under extreme pressure. These events were presented as educational opportunities that would teach important lessons about leadership, teamwork, and personal excellence, while concealing their true purpose as gladiatorial contests, where failure meant death. The medical examinations that all children underwent on regular schedules were not routine health checkups, but comprehensive evaluations of their genetic potential, physical development, and biological suitability for breeding programs that would begin as soon as they reached reproductive maturity. These examinations included procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics while providing researchers with detailed information about each child's genetic heritage and developmental trajectory. The children who failed to meet the Vault standards for genetic excellence or psychological resilience were not transferred to other programs or provided with alternative educational opportunities, but were systematically eliminated through methods that were presented as accidents, illnesses, or disciplinary actions rather than deliberate murder. Their deaths served both to maintain genetic purity within the surviving population and to provide psychological pressure that motivated remaining children to excel in their academic and physical performance. The indoctrination programs that shaped the children's understanding of their situation and their role in humanity's future were designed to create acceptance of their treatment while preventing them from developing moral objections to the systematic abuse they witnessed and experienced daily. These psychological conditioning sessions used techniques borrowed from military training and cult recruitment to break down individual identity while building loyalty to the Vault's mission and the scientific staff who controlled every aspect of their lives. The social structures that emerged among the children reflected the competitive and hierarchical environment that the Vault staff had deliberately created, with stronger and more intelligent children forming alliances that provided protection from systematic abuse, while weaker children were relegated to positions where they served as targets for violence and exploitation. These dynamics were encouraged by staff members who understood that internal conflict would prevent the children from organizing resistance against their captors, while providing additional stress that would accelerate the selection process. The living conditions within Vault 75 were deliberately harsh and uncomfortable, with children housed in overcrowded dormitories where privacy was impossible and personal possessions were forbidden, creating environmental stress that would identify those individuals whose psychological resilience made them suitable for breeding, while eliminating those whose mental fragility made them unsuitable for reproducing enhanced human beings. The constant surveillance and lack of personal autonomy served both security purposes and psychological conditioning objectives that would prepare survivors for their eventual role as breeding stock. The nutrition programs that governed the children's diet were designed not to promote healthy development, but to create controlled malnutrition that would stress their developing bodies while providing researchers with data about genetic responses to food scarcity and dietary restriction. The children were told that their sparse rations were necessary due to limited resources, concealing the fact that adequate food was available but was being withheld for experimental purposes that treated their hunger and suffering as valuable research data. The education that children did receive was carefully selected to serve the Vault's experimental objectives, rather than providing them with knowledge and skills that would enable them to function as independent adults in post-war society. They were taught obedience, acceptance of authority, and basic skills that would make them useful as controlled breeding subjects while being denied access to information about their rights, their situation, or the outside world that might enable them to resist their treatment or escape their captivity. The punishment systems that maintained discipline within the Vault were designed to be so severe and unpredictable that children would focus all their energy on avoiding punishment rather than questioning the legitimacy of their treatment or organizing resistance against their captors. These disciplinary measures included physical torture, psychological abuse, and public humiliation that served both to control behavior and to provide entertainment for staff members who derived satisfaction from watching children suffer. The genetic testing that monitored each child's development included procedures that were presented as routine medical care, but actually involved experimental treatments designed to enhance desirable genetic traits while suppressing characteristics that researchers viewed as undesirable for future human evolution. These interventions caused significant pain and suffering while producing physiological changes that would affect the children's development in ways that served the Vault's breeding objectives rather than their personal well-being. The approaching 18th birthdays that marked the end of childhood within Vault 75's system were not celebrated as coming-of-age milestones, but dreaded as deadlines when survivors would face final end evaluations that would determine whether they had earned the right to participate in breeding programs or would be eliminated as genetically inferior individuals whose continued existence served no purpose for humanity's future. These evaluations were comprehensive assessments of genetic quality, psychological suitability, and reproductive potential that would decide each young person's fate. The breeding programs that awaited those children who survived to adulthood were not romantic relationships based on love and mutual attraction, but systematic mating arrangements designed to produce offspring with enhanced genetic characteristics while providing researchers with data about heredity, reproductive biology, and child development under controlled laboratory conditions. These programs treated human reproduction as industrial processes subject to quality control measures and efficiency optimization, rather than natural expressions of love and family formation. The harvesting procedures that claimed the lives of children who reached adulthood but were deemed unsuitable for breeding represented the ultimate expression of the Vault's utilitarian philosophy, with human beings treated as sources of biological material whose genetic heritage could be preserved through tissue samples and reproductive cells, while their conscious existence was terminated as no longer necessary for research objectives. These procedures were conducted with the same clinical detachment that characterized all aspects of the Vault's operations. The psychological profiles of staff members who could participate in systematic child abuse while maintaining professional demeanor revealed the complete moral corruption that was necessary for implementing programs that treated human children as laboratory animals whose suffering was acceptable, collateral damage in pursuit of genetic enhancement objectives. These individuals had abandoned every principle of human decency while convincing themselves that their work served the greater good of humanity's survival and improvement. The documentation that recorded every aspect of Vault 75's operations created comprehensive records of systematic child abuse disguised as scientific research, providing future historians with detailed accounts of how civilized societies could descend into barbarism when utilitarian philosophies were allowed to override moral constraints that protected vulnerable populations from exploitation by those with power over their lives and welfare. In the end, Vault 75 represented the ultimate perversion of humanity's relationship with its own children, demonstrating how quickly protective instincts could be overcome by pseudo-scientific theories that justified treating young people as raw materials for genetic engineering, rather than precious individuals whose welfare should be society's highest priority, creating a legacy of horror that would serve as a permanent reminder of what happened when scientific ambition was divorced from moral consideration and human compassion. The shadows that stretched across America in the years following the Great War contained secrets that would never be fully catalogued or understood, hidden vaults scattered throughout the continental wasteland, where other experiments had been conducted according to protocols that exceeded even the horrors of the facilities whose stories had been preserved through survivor testimonies and recovered documentation. These unnamed installations represented the full scope of Vault-Tech's ambition to transform human survival into scientific opportunity, creating laboratories where the boundaries of ethical research had been not merely crossed, but obliterated entirely, in pursuit of knowledge that served no purpose beyond satisfying the curiosity of researchers who had lost all connection to human empathy and moral reasoning. The corporate records that documented the full extent of Vault-Tech's experimental program were destroyed during the nuclear bombardment that claimed the lives of most company executives and government officials who had authorized the systematic abuse of American citizens under the guise of preserving civilization. But fragments of information that survived in scattered databases and personal communications suggested that the known vaults represented only a fraction of the facilities where human beings had been subjected to procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity that had been established through centuries of moral progress. Vault 34's overcrowding experiment had condemned an entire community to slow death through resource depletion and social breakdown, with twice the intended population sealed into spaces designed for half their number, while researchers documented the progression of starvation, violence, and cannibalism that resulted from systematic overpopulation. The survivors who eventually escaped carried with them not only the physical scars of malnutrition and violence, but psychological trauma that would affect their ability to form normal social relationships throughout their remaining lives. Vault 92's musical experiment had subjected residents to constant exposure to subliminal audio frequencies that were designed to influence mood, behavior, and cognitive function, while researchers studied the effects of sound manipulation on human psychology and social organization. The residents who lived for decades under the influence of these hidden audio programs developed behavioral modifications that made them incapable of independent thought, while remaining unaware that their actions were being controlled by technologies they could neither detect nor resist. The drug experiments conducted in Vault 95 had tested the effects of various psychoactive compounds on child development and educational outcomes, with researchers administering experimental medications to young residents under the guise of providing nutritional supplements, while documenting how chemical manipulation of developing nervous systems affected learning capacity, social behavior, and moral reasoning. The children who survived these experiments carried neurological damage that would affect their cognitive abilities and emotional stability throughout their adult lives. Vault 100 and one's control experiment had been designed to remain sealed indefinitely, while researchers studied how isolated communities would evolve socially and culturally over multiple generations of underground existence, creating conditions where residents would develop their own customs, beliefs, and social structures without outside influence, while remaining completely unaware that their entire civilization was an artificial construct created for scientific observation rather than genuine community development. The water contamination studies conducted in Vault 13 had involved the systematic introduction of various toxins and radioactive materials into drinking water supplies, while researchers monitored their effects on human health and genetic expression across multiple generations of residents who remained unaware that their chronic illnesses and genetic mutations were the result of deliberate poisoning rather than natural environmental hazards or hereditary conditions that had affected their families through random chance. The sleep deprivation experiments that had been conducted in Vault 43 had subjected entire populations to systematic disruption of normal rest cycles through artificial lighting, chemical stimulants, and psychological stress techniques that were designed to determine how long human beings could function without adequate sleep while maintaining their ability to perform complex cognitive and physical tasks necessary for community, survival, and technological operation. The temperature control studies implemented in Vault 56 had exposed residents to extreme heat and cold conditions that tested the limits of human physiological adaptation, while documenting how environmental stress affected reproduction, child development, and social organization within communities that were forced to adapt their entire way of life to accommodate conditions that exceeded normal human tolerance for temperature variation. Vault 68's gender ratio experiment had created a community with only one man among 999 women, while researchers studied how extreme gender imbalances would affect social dynamics, reproductive behavior, and power structures within isolated populations that were forced to develop new forms of social organization to accommodate demographic conditions that had no precedent in normal human civilization. The genetic modification programs that had been conducted in various classified vaults had involved direct manipulation of human DNA through viral vectors and chemical treatments that were designed to create enhanced human beings with improved physical capabilities, extended lifespans, and increased intelligence, while treating the residents who underwent these modifications as laboratory animals whose suffering was acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of species improvement objectives. The artificial intelligence experiments that had been conducted in several facilities had involved the systematic replacement of human decision-making with computer systems that controlled every aspect of community life, while residents remained unaware that their choices were being made by machines rather than their own conscious intentions, creating populations of human beings who believed they were exercising free will, while actually serving as components in technological systems that treated consciousness as a programmable resource. The time perception studies that had manipulated residents' understanding of temporal progression through drug treatments, artificial lighting, and sensory deprivation had created communities where individuals lost track of how long they had been underground. While researchers documented how confusion about time affected psychological stability, social relationships, and cultural development within populations that could no longer distinguish between days, months, or years of confinement. The sensory substitution experiments that had systematically damaged residents' vision, hearing, or other sensory capabilities, while providing technological replacements, had studied how human consciousness adapted to artificial sensory input, while treating the subjects who lost their natural sensory abilities as sources of data about these neuroplasticity, rather than human beings who deserved compensation for the disabilities that had been deliberately inflicted upon them for research purposes. The memory manipulation programs that had used chemical and technological interventions to alter residents' recollections of their past experiences had created populations of individuals who could no longer distinguish between authentic memories and artificially implanted experiences, leaving them psychologically unable to maintain stable identities or form meaningful relationships based on shared understanding of their personal histories and community development. The pain tolerance studies that had subjected residents to systematic torture disguised as medical treatment had documented human responses to various forms of physical and psychological suffering, while researchers maintained clinical detachment from the agony they were inflicting on subjects who had been told they were receiving advanced medical care rather than participating in systematic abuse programs designed to map the outer limits of human endurance. The reproductive control experiments that had manipulated fertility, pregnancy outcomes, and child development through chemical interventions and selective breeding programs had treated human reproduction as industrial processes subject to optimization rather than natural expressions of love and family formation, creating conditions where children were born to serve research objectives rather than to experience the nurturing relationships that were essential for healthy human development. The behavioral modification programs that had used reward and punishment systems to shape residents' actions and responses had created communities where individual autonomy was systematically destroyed, while researchers documented how human beings could be trained to perform complex behaviors without understanding the purposes they were serving or the moral implications of their participation in activities that violated fundamental principles of human dignity and ethical conduct. The social engineering experiments that had manipulated community structures, leadership systems, and cultural practices had treated human civilization as a controllable variable that could be adjusted according to research protocols, while residents remained unaware that their entire social reality had been constructed by scientists who viewed their relationships, beliefs, and customs as data points rather than meaningful expressions of human culture and community identity. The survivors who emerged from these scattered facilities carried with them not only the physical and psychological damage that had been inflicted during their years of captivity, but also the knowledge that their suffering had served no legitimate scientific purpose beyond satisfying the curiosity of researchers who had abandoned every principle of human decency while pursuing knowledge that could never justify the methods that had been used to obtain it. The wasteland communities that eventually developed around these former vault sites were shaped by the trauma and knowledge that survivors brought with them from their underground experiences, creating settlements where trust was difficult to establish and normal social relationships were complicated by the understanding that human beings were capable of inflicting systematic cruelty on their fellow citizens, while maintaining the fiction that such abuse served legitimate scientific or social purposes. The technologies and knowledge that had been developed through these experimental programs were sometimes preserved and applied to benefit post-war communities, but their origins in systematic human abuse created moral dilemmas for survivors who had to decide whether using information obtained through torture and murder could ever be justified by the benefits it might provide to innocent people who had played no role in the original crimes against humanity. The documentation that survived from these facilities provided evidence of systematic violations of human rights that exceeded the scope of war crimes that had been prosecuted by international tribunals. But the collapse of governmental and legal institutions meant that no accountability would ever be demanded from those responsible for conceiving, authorizing, and implementing programs that had treated American citizens as experimental animals, whose suffering was acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of scientific objectives. The psychological impact on researchers and staff members who had participated in these programs was rarely documented or studied, but the few records that survived suggested that prolonged participation in systematic abuse had created individuals who were no longer capable of normal human empathy or moral reasoning, transforming them into beings who could inflict suffering without experiencing the psychological distress that would have affected mentally healthy individuals exposed to similar circumstances. The cultural memory of these experiments was preserved in oral traditions that developed among wasteland communities, with stories about the horrors of vault life, serving both as warnings about the dangers of unchecked scientific authority and as explanations for the social dysfunction and psychological trauma that affected survivors and their descendants throughout the post-war period, creating legends that would influence human behavior and social organization for generations. In the end, the legacy of Vault-Tech's experimental program extended far beyond the immediate suffering of those who had been subjected to systematic abuse in underground laboratories, creating a civilization where trust between human beings had been fundamentally damaged by the knowledge that scientific progress could serve as justification for any form of cruelty, while institutions that claimed to protect human welfare could be perverted into mechanisms for systematic exploitation of the vulnerable populations they were supposed to serve. The men and women in white coats who conceived these experiments were not monsters born from radiation or twisted by war, but ordinary human beings who had convinced themselves that the pursuit of knowledge justified any suffering they might inflict upon their fellow citizens in service of what they believed was the greater good of human survival and scientific progress. They sat in corporate boardrooms and government offices, speaking in sanitized language about research protocols and statistical significance, while designing programs that would transform underground shelters into laboratories where human dignity would be systematically destroyed through procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and moral reasoning. The vault doors that sealed on October 23, 2077, closed not merely on radiation and fallout, but on the last remnants of a civilization that had chosen to preserve itself through the systematic sacrifice of its most vulnerable members, creating underground worlds where the promise of safety became a guarantee of suffering, and where the technologies designed to protect human life were perverted into instruments for destroying everything that made life worth living. But even in these depths of institutional cruelty and scientific hubris, individual human beings found ways to resist the dehumanization that surrounded them, choosing compassion over compliance and moral courage over personal survival. Dr. Olivet sabotaged experiments that would have poisoned his patients. 5 residents of Vault 11 chose defiance over murder. These acts of resistance remind us that human dignity can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, conscience still burns bright against the forces that would extinguish it. Sweet dreams, wanderer. Dawn always comes, even after the longest nights.